Volume 1, Chapter 1, Rebirth of the Scorned King. Rejection. It was funny, really. Muzan was very intimate with that word. Far too much for his liking. It followed him since the day he was spat out into this world, and from that day forward, it haunted him like a shadow always behind him, always reminding him that he wasn't made for this world. From birth, life rejected him, but he forced his way into being forced the world to acknowledge his existence. The result of his insolence was that his body was far too frail, bones too weak, blood too thin, and flesh so tender that even the faintest of cuts would spell out his doom. Every doctor within the country that was willing to see him had told his family that he would not live past 20 years old. Most people, when they were told that they wouldn't get to live past early adulthood, would shrink into themselves and allow themselves to wither away and die. But not Muzan. Muzan rejected that notion totally and utterly. His parents, bless their souls, had done everything they could for him. They fetched every doctor from across the world to try and help him, to make him strong, to make him a true heir to the Kibutsuji clan. But no matter what medicine those doctors gave him, no matter what combination of drugs that were forced down his throat, nothing would make him whole. His parents despaired at that fact and lost all hope for him. But Muzan refused to kowtow out of fate. He would not die. So, despite his family telling him to give up and to accept his fate, Muzan continued to allow doctors to approach him. Each doctor gave a unique method to try and cure his ailment, but nothing would bear fruit. Nothing would heal his rapidly failing body. It got to the point that upon his 19th birthday, Muzan had begun to even accept snake oil salesmen to approach the door to see if they could heal him. Not even they could do it. On the evening of his 20th birthday, when his body had mostly failed him, leaving him bedridden, the last doctor in a line of snake oil salesmen approached him with a supposed cure-all medicine created out of a flower that was said to only exist on Mount Komotori. That flower was the blue spider lily, which was known for having healing properties if fully consumed alongside a concoction of drugs. Muzan only ever consumed half of the drug before killing the doctor after being told that he had to wait an extra day to take the other half, and said other half had yet to be prepared. Because of his lack of patience, he had doomed himself. Or so he thought. Because when he killed the doctor, some of the doctor's blood had made its way into his mouth. Perhaps it was because of the doctor's blood mixing with the drugs and the blue spider lily that had turned him into what he became. Perhaps it was the gods punishing him for acting like a petulant child. But whatever the case might have been, all Muzan knew was this. He had become a demon, a monster of myth, a beast that wore the flesh of a human and consumed them by the dozen. A fate worse than death, some might say. But to Muzan, it had been a true gift. No longer was he weak. No longer was he frail. No longer would he die at the young age of 20. He would live forever. Or so he wished. The sun scorned him. Humanity feared him. The life he wanted to lead was robbed from him. Coupled with the unquenchable desire to consume flesh, Muzan fled his estate, but not before slaughtering his entire clan, save for one child, and disappearing into the night. After all, it was his clan that had birthed him in that frail, weak state. They were to blame for his fate. Over the months, he learned that by consuming others, he would gain more power. So, that was exactly what he did. He would consume, devour, and gain strength by night, recover by day, and repeat the process. For 5 years, he lived by those instincts, like a beast hunting prey, until, one day, he learned that he could turn others to his kind by sharing his blood. It didn't take long for Muzan to realize that he had become something more than a regular demon. While demons could not reproduce naturally, which he had attempted to do once or twice before eventually giving up, they could reproduce by having their blood inserted into either a corpse or a living person. Muzan would proceed to amass an army of demons who were loyal to him and him alone. Granted, his army was not meant to take over Japan, but rather, his goal was to strike fear into humanity, to show them that they were the weak ones, that they were the ones who should fear an early death, not him. To Muzan, it was the ultimate revenge. Humanity had birthed him a weak body and turned him into this thing. But instead of disappearing and becoming nothing more than a folktale, Muzan wanted to keep humanity on their toes, to make them watch their every step, to fear every shadow, and doubt their neighbors and family. From that day forth, Muzan Kibutsuji became the Demon King. For 500 years, from the Heian era to the Sengoku era, Muzan lived as he pleased, killing, eating, turning, and terrorizing towns. A group of people calling themselves the Demon Slayer Corps popped up around the Kamakura era and the Muromachi era to kill him and his demons. While a few of them had killed some of his weaker demons, none of them ever came close to those who he had dubbed the upper and lower moons, let alone himself. All except for one, and that man had two titles. The one the Slayers gave him, and the one Muzan gave him. Yurichi Tsujikuni, the Sun Breather. The very first to invent breathing styles the bane of Muzan's existence. The man who struck fear into the Demon King. The man who made the once proud and boisterous Muzan Kibutsuji a meek, pathetic creature and forced him into hiding. Yurichi Tsujikuni, the Great Bastard. Demon to demonkind. Wretch and terrorizer of the Demon King and all those who would serve his majesty. The man who would eventually pave the way for a new era of demon slayers more powerful than the last, forcing demonkind to lurk in the shadows. He and those who followed him wove fear into Muzan's many hearts, prompting him to go even as far as turning Yurichi's brother into a demon. Even when Yurichi died, Muzan still feared him, still looked over his shoulder whenever he stepped outside, waiting for when Yurichi would turn the corner and hunt him just as he had all those years ago. It instilled a great fear into Muzan, and that fear was what eventually led to Muzan making the worst mistake of his entire life. He created the second coming of Yurichi. He created Tanjiro Kamado. Not literally, of course, but the simple action of killing the Kamado family out of paranoia due to their connection with Yurichi caused a domino effect, which led to his current situation as death. Muzan had been killed, his body poisoned and burnt by the sun, but not before throwing a final Hail Mary in an attempt to stay alive. He infected Tanjiro with his blood in a vain attempt to turn him into his successor, create a secondary demon king, one more powerful than the last, and usurp his body in order to achieve his lifelong desire of finally basking in the sun. And yet, despite his words of temptation, despite his desperation and his pathetic final pleas for mercy, Tanjiro rejected him. He purged the blood and had somehow managed to cure himself of the infection using reverse-engineered demon blood created by Tamayo. Muzan should have known that was what would have happened. Muzan should have known that Tanjiro would have chosen humanity over demonkind. And so, as he had so often encountered, for the third and final time, life rejected Muzan Kibutsuji, a man who feared death, only having ever wanted to live. A man who, despite his many, many faults, only wanted to have a chance at a normal life. Muzan's soul fell into the fiery pits of hell, the place where he belonged. All demons were sent to hell, ne'er to return to the land of the living. They were not even given the chance to reincarnate, for they had forsaken their natural-born lives to become monsters. He felt the fires of hell encircling him, closing in, the crimson flames caressing his very soul. It burned worse than even the flames of the sun. He tried to reach out towards the light as he plummeted further and further into the abyss, but to no avail. Muzan tried to scream, but no sound came from his mouth. His eyes, bloodshot and filled with a concoction of various emotions and feelings, anger, sadness, remorse, hatred, longing to widen the further he got from the light of life. It was ironic. When he was alive, he awoke on a bed of flowers ready to be cremated. In death, he was surrounded by the very same flames. The flames of death. His mind raced with various thoughts, but the one that kept circling back to him was a thought that he had never once had up until now. What would be his legacy, if any at all? Humanity never believed demons existed. Demons were seen as nothing more than fairy tales, even during his time alive. He lived as he had died, an afterthought, rejected by society and the world. His family, for as much as they had cared for him, never tried to get to know him. The Ubuyashiki clan, the descendants of the Kibutsuji clan, despised him as much as he despised them. The only ones who would be left to tell his tale would die before they reached 30. Then it dawned on him. What would come of him and his memory? He would be forgotten in the annals of history. Everything he had worked to accomplish and achieve would be buried. His name, face, identity, and work would be left to rot. His very existence would never be remembered, and his actions would only become folklore for his country. And as he fell deeper into the fiery pits of hell, as his soul burned away into nothingness, the words of Kaguya wormed their way into his mind. I know what eternity is. Eternity is human feeling. Only human feelings last forever and are undying. My death will not be insignificant. If anything, it will only further boost their morale. For the first and last time, thank you, Muzan. Kaguya's final words ate at him, just as the flames of hell were destroying him. And while at first Muzan believed Kaguya was mocking him, the truth was rather simple. Kaguya had seen him for what he had been, a man who was lost and without a purpose, stumbling in the dark, trying to find meaning in life. Kaguya, despite his hatred, did not reject him. Instead, Kaguya tried to understand him, and in that understanding, he had found the answer that Muzan had been longing for. Kaguya, a human, had found an answer for eternity. Memories. Memories that would not exist of Muzan. The demon slayers had accomplished their goal. They purged him of life and eternity. The fires of hell crawled over his soul, dragging him deeper and deeper, smothering him, forcing him deeper into hell. No, this would not do. Muzan's arm breached the hellfire, heavily burned and covered in welts and rotting flesh. His claws hooked onto something, as he dangled off what his heavily damaged eyes could recognize as a small tear in the abyss. With a Herculean effort, Muzan swung his other arm toward the tear in the abyss that was hell, and tore it open more. He would not be forgotten. He was Muzan Kibutsuji. He was the Demon King. He was eternal. He was perfection. Muzan pulled with all of his might, ripping his still burning soul from the fires of hell, pulling himself toward the light he had made for himself. Just as he had been born in flames, he would be reincarnated from the depths of hell itself. Whoever said that demons could not reincarnate was a fool. They had clearly never met him before. He refused to be rejected. Damn you, Muzan roared, cursing himself as he pulled. His mutilated and burned body was crumbling, falling apart at the seams. If even just a sliver of his existence poured through, that was more than enough to grant him a second chance. He reached his heavily burned hand into the light as he could feel his skin tearing apart. Muscle tore and bones began to crack as the hell fire tried to absorb him back into the flames. But as his hand breached the abyss and touched the light, a wicked smile plastered itself on Muzan's face. The fires roared, burning brighter than before, but that was fine with him. From the elbow down, his arm broke off before sliding into the light. A victorious laugh echoed throughout the abyss as he was plunged deeper and deeper into the flames. I will not be forgotten, Muzan shouted, the flames overtaking him as he cackled victoriously. Did you see that, Kaguya? Did you see my triumph? Even in death, I am above you. And triumph he did. Because as that arm drifted about in the light, it began to twitch, shrinking down to the size of an infant's arm and healing. Before that arm grew the rest of its body. A small, healthy baby boy. As that baby drifted toward another, brighter light, parts of itself began to change. Tips of fingers were replaced by sharp claws, and the baby's jaws strengthened to give it the capability to chew through human bones. The baby's teeth sharpened, and its sense of smell strengthened. Multiple hearts appeared within its body, all placed throughout in various locations, although smaller than the main heart. With that came multiple smaller brains attached to those hearts, a life insurance of sorts, in case the main heart and brain was to be destroyed. Finally, the last change made just before the baby reached the light was a crucial change, one that would alter the baby from now unto forever, even more so than it was already altered. There was a common saying that every living being knew instinctively. The newer generation was always superior than the previous generation. It did not matter if it was a biological organism or a manufactured product. Advancements were always better. And this was no different. Because when Muzan died, and when his soul clung desperately onto Tanjiro as he had turned into a demon and conquered the sun, a bit of that power had passed down to Muzan. And that power had passed down to this newborn demon. The power to reject the sun's damnation. This newborn demon would be able to exist under the preview of the very thing that Muzan sought to conquer. And as that baby crossed over from the light of life into the world of the living, surrounded by the sounds of beeping machines and extremely bright light, the baby began to cry a sign of life. The male doctor that held the baby in his gloved hands announced the baby's delivery as the mother of the baby let out a tired cry of joy. The wet nurse carefully took the child from the doctor and passed the boy to its mother. The mother soothed the child, putting him close to her chest. The child, recognizing its mother's heartbeat, quietened down. The loud noises slowly disappeared, and the only thing the infant focused on was the breathing and heartbeat of his mother. And while the baby could not understand what the mother was saying, it did pick up one thing. A thing that sounded like a name. Izuku. 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 The infant's name was Izuku. It was often said that a name was what completed the soul. Just as this newborn infant had been created from the remnants of a man who had been the supposed pinnacle of life, this newborn's name reflected that previous purpose, even if it did not know that yet. It wasn't long after Izuku received his name that his eyes began to open. They were expecting something normal. But Izuku was not normal. Unlike so many children before him, Izuku's pupils were not soft and round like most human eyes, which was something that the doctors and the mother had expected. Izuku's eyes were sharp and cat-like, piercing and frightening. And what was even more bizarre was that Izuku's eyes were not green like his mother's, nor were they brown like his father's. They were a bright crimson red, the same shade of color as blood. Words were thrown, words that Izuku did not understand. But what he did understand was the strange, yet welcoming look on his mother's face. A face with bright green eyes, soft round pupils, and a youthful glow to her expression. Emerald green hair framed her face and draped over her shoulders, and her lips were turned up in a smile. Her mouth opened, and sounds came out that Izuku didn't understand. The only thing that Izuku understood was his name being spoke back to him. His clawed hand reached out at his mother, and as his mother stuck a finger into his tiny little hand, a curious sound fell out of his mouth, which prompted his mother to make a sound that echoed with joy. Izuku had only been alive for a few minutes, but as far as Izuku had been concerned, his mother was someone who he knew he could trust. And, as far as Inko Midoriya was concerned, regardless of how her son appeared, and regardless of his eyes, she knew that Izuku destined for greatness. After all, that was why she gave him that name. His name, Izuku Midoriya, was supposed to mean that he was destined for greatness, like what all mothers wanted of their children. But whether or not Izuku, his mother Inko, or the doctors in the hospital room knew it or not, the reality of the situation and the implications of Izuku's birth had not dawned on them. Because for the first time in 200 years, a demon was created. Now, in the era of peace brought about by All Might, where the world had long forgotten about the scourge that was demonkind, in an era where Nichiren blades and their creation was long since forgotten by the communities that had once produced them, and in an era of quirks, demonkind would once again encroach on humanity. And this time, it would not go away. This time, it would not be forgotten. Volume 1, Chapter 2, Dawn casts a shadow on the unfortunate. Morning sun, bright and cheerful. Clear blue sky. White fluffy clouds. All the signs of a typical morning in the springtime in Japan with a small chance for rain. The sound of cars driving to and from work filled the busy streets within the city of Mizudafu, which was wedged between the cities of Tokyo and Hosu, while still being a part of the greater Tokyo prefecture. Every day civilians would walk down the sidewalks, approaching the train stations to get to their wanted destinations, young and old people alike. Crowded streets with cars trying to get ahead of one another, only to fail and be stuck behind yet another seemingly incompetent driver. That was why walking was seen as the better way of transport. Multiple towering buildings of all varying purpose lined the sidewalks. Some were only a single story, others had multiple. Some were meant for business, others held apartments, and even a scarce few were abandoned due to the building owners neglecting them. Like most other cities, Mizudafu was home to several schools, but the one that was the most important right now was a little-known elementary school called Sunshine Elementary. The school wasn't really well known outside of those who lived in the poorer and lower middle class ends of the city. Not that the children who went to that school noticed. The staff there did their best to teach the children, even if they were mostly unruly. Those who were aware of the school had called it the school for troublemakers, primarily due to the fact that those who come from it usually wind up being delinquents. It was primarily a coincidence, though. But it didn't help when most of the kids there were always running around and constantly causing trouble for the less involved ones. One such case was a young boy with dark green hair, minding his own business, playing in the playground sandbox. The boy was dressed in a yellow shirt, a pair of brown shorts, ankle-high black socks, and red and black runners. His skin was as pale as a ghost, though that was due to a genetic condition. His hands were clawed, and his crimson red eyes were sharp like a cat's. He barely stood at 4 feet tall, and his aforementioned dark green hair was bushy and all over the place like a shrub. Izuku Midoriya, which was the boy's name, sat in the sandbox, molding the sand to take the shape of a rough-looking tower that would eventually become a castle. All the while, everyone else in his class was off swinging on monkey bars, sliding down slides, chasing each other in games of tag. A part of him wanted to join in on the fun, but Izuku knew how he would be received. He was an outcast. No one wanted to be friends with him, because he was scary-looking. Most people weren't as pale as he was, even in a quirked society like the one he lived in. His claws were unusually sharp, so he found himself accidentally scratching people with them, which didn't help his reputation much. His eyes didn't help things, either. They were always so intense, as one teacher put it, as if he was trying to glare a hole into something or someone. Even now, with his downcast demeanor, his eyes didn't really relax or mellow out. They were always in a constant state of pointed and alert. As a result, he was often left alone. Not because he wanted to be alone, but because no one wanted to be near someone like him. No one wanted to hang around someone who was so scary, which was dumb in his opinion. There was a boy with a reptile face in the 3rd grade right now, and Izuku thought he was scarier. Not that it particularly mattered anymore. Izuku had accepted a long time ago that he was going to be alone for a majority of his school life. Or, at least, that was what he wished to be the case. Just because he was left alone by people who he might have wanted to be friends with, that didn't mean he was left completely alone. "Oi, freak," a high-pitched yet also rough-sounding voice spat behind him as Izuku looked over his shoulder. Spiky, explosive blonde hair, ruby-red eyes, cream-colored skin. All the defining traits of Bakugo Katsuki, of whom was dressed in a blue shirt with an explosive icon on the front and similar shorts to Izuku. "Get out of my sandbox." "It's not your sandbox, though," Izuku said, which prompted Bakugo to grab Izuku by the back of the collar and fling him out, causing Izuku to tumble for a few seconds and bonk his head against a nearby tree. Izuku hissed, a hint of pain in his voice as he rubbed the back of his head. He watched as Bakugo kicked over his work-in-progress sandcastle before laughing and running off. Izuku stared, watching with mounting frustration. It was always like this. Even when he wanted to be alone, Bakugo Katsuki was always there to put the freak in his place. That was all he was. A freak. He was a freak because of his appearance. What was worse was that the teachers never did anything to correct his attitude. After all, he was blessed with a powerful quirk, and it was their job to ensure his bright future. He had caught them saying that to each other whenever someone would mention that Bakugo was being a jerk. They had no intention of teaching him a lesson. Jerks, Izuku thought as he came to his feet, brushing himself off, rubbing his arm as the bruise that had begun to form disappeared. It had been something he had learned that his body could do when he was very little, around the age of a toddler, when he accidentally cut his finger on a piece of paper, which was rather bizarre. See, Izuku's quirk was, for the lack of a better word, weird. He had clear mutations with his eyes, skin, and claws, even his sharp and strong teeth. All clear signs that his quirk would be mutant in nature. But then he also displayed transformation-type quirk capabilities with his regeneration. Although, those two quirk types were often paired together, so it wasn't all that bizarre. However, it did get bizarre when you realized that neither his mother Inko, whose quirk allowed her to bring small objects toward her using a weak form of telekinesis, and his father Hisashi, whose quirk allowed him to breathe fire, had nothing in common with Izuku's quirk. It was that detail, him having a mutant quirk, which caused his father to leave his mother when Izuku was 3 years old. Despite having similar facial features to him, and despite having the same hair growth, his father refused to believe that Izuku was his child. The only reason why they got child support from him was because a judge had ordered a DNA test, and, shocked to absolutely nobody, Hisashi was his father. Not that his mother cared about that fact anymore. She had been done with him the moment the accusation came falling out of his face. Still, it was sad that their otherwise happy marriage had been broken apart by quirkism. Izuku felt slightly responsible for what happened, if not entirely. Not that he would ever mention that to his mother. The last thing he wanted was for her to be upset. She was already worried enough as it was. What with her having to consider taking up 2 jobs to support them. That was another thing about Izuku. He was more emotionally intelligent than most, able to pick up on minor things such as the twitch of an eye or a raising of the shoulder. It allowed him to get a better picture of the kind of person he was dealing with. It was why he was so frustrated with Bakugo. Every action he performed was out of malice, hate, anger, all aimed toward the poor fool who happened to be in his way. Yet, he wanted to be a hero. What kind of hero would take their anger out against those who didn't deserve it? Izuku didn't know. But what Izuku did know, however, was that All Might would never act that way. As he walked away from the sandbox, knowing full well that if he went back to it, Bakugo would turn around and heckle him some more, Izuku went back toward the building. The teacher, who had seen the altercation, simply stared and said nothing as he walked past them. One day, Izuku thought, his right hand balling into a fist. One day I'll show you. I'll show you all. The rest of the day played out like every other day. Learn basic language skills that Izuku already knew because of his mother and his ability to pick up on things quickly, quiet reading time, and watching The Daily Show until it was some kid named Kasuka's turn and he was showing off his limited edition Endeavor action figure. When school was let out, Izuku walked home not because his mother forgot to pick him up, but because they didn't have a car and his mother was more than likely just getting home from work. Either that or she was just arriving at home. Besides, the elementary school was only a 5-minute walk from the apartment they lived in. His mother had enough trust in him and enough belief in him that he could get home safely. The apartment building that he lived in was 12 stories tall, each with 3 apartments on every floor. The building itself was a muddy brown color, and it was one of a group of 3 buildings. She lived in the first building. There was an outdoor staircase that took the person climbing it to the desired floor, which for Izuku was the top floor. Upon reaching the top floor of the apartment building, he walked down the outdoor hallway/balcony, his expression blank as he approached his apartment door, 1204, and looked under the welcome mat sat in front of the door. There, sitting under the mat, was a golden key. Picking up the key and inserting it into the front door, Izuku twisted the key to the left, and upon hearing a click, Izuku removed the key and slipped it back under the mat. Opening the door, Izuku stepped inside of the apartment and closed the door behind him, locking it just as his mother instructed that he do if he ever found himself home alone. He once heard that it was bad for a child below the age of 13 being home alone, but more often than not, that was his reality. Not because his mother didn't care, but because his mother cared too much, so much so to the point where she'd pulled double shifts to make sure they had enough money to survive. In times like these, when he had a feeling his mother would be running late, Izuku would eat whatever leftovers there was, watch the TV until his mom came home, or for a few hours, whichever happened first, then go to his room and teach himself how to do higher forms of education. Why did he do that? Because he loved to learn. He loved to take notes. He loved to study. When he was born, the doctors had said that he had extra brains and extra hearts, not functional, but also harmless. However, he was convinced they did do something because he had always wanted to learn. Even when he was a baby. According to his mom, he was always watching shows that were more learning-based than the normal slop that someone like Bakugo would watch. His favorite hero was All Might. Then again, everyone's favorite hero was All Might, but after that his favorite hero was 13, the space hero. Why? Because on top of being a hero, she was an astronaut and often taught lessons on TV. Those lessons were about physics and other extremely high-caliber material reserved for final-year students in high school. Yet, Izuku always loved tuning into those when he was a toddler. Not that he understood what they were saying because of his infantile mind, but it was a start. He attributed that early development in his attitude part of the reason why he wanted to learn so much, because he was exposed to it. It also helped that his mother was always on him to learn how to speak, how to walk, and how to play. A perfect example of this was that he was ahead of everyone in learning how to write. He could write whole paragraphs with, admittedly, only a few mistakes. But everyone else was still learning basic hiragana. Meanwhile, Izuku was leagues ahead of them. Once he was able to write a whole paragraph in hiragana with no mistakes, he'd be allowed to learn kanji. As for the apartment that Izuku lived in with his mother, it wasn't all that big. There was an entry hallway that broke off into a miniature closet that held coats and shoes. Ahead of that, there was a joint dining room, and living room split down the middle with the dark brown fabric couch being the dividing piece. Across from the split living room and dining room was the kitchen, which was adorned with several cupboards, a stove with an oven, a fridge with a freezer attached, an aluminum sink, and, of course, with some counter space. There was a hallway off to the right of the kitchen, and in that hallway was a bathroom with a standing shower, and beside the bathroom was his mother's bedroom. Across from his mother's bedroom was his bedroom, but aside from that, there wasn't much else about his apartment. It wasn't much, but it was home. Taking his shoes off at the front door, Izuku stepped past the divot between the entrance and the rest of the apartment and ran to his room. His bedroom was what one would expect from the room of a child. Posters of his favorite heroes, a toy box filled with action figures, a dresser for his clothes, and a single-sized bed with All Might-themed coverings. There was also a desk off in the corner with writing and drawing supplies. There was a can full of pencils, a stack of papers, and a can full of colored pencils, all of which were kept to the left corner of the desk. Izuku made a beeline to his desk, pulled out the chair, hopped up on it, and sat down. Every day, after school, he always dedicated at the bare minimum a half an hour of practicing his hiragana and kanji, with at most giving himself an hour. Then, until his mother would come home, he'd draw whatever came to mind. Although his last few drawings were strange. Izuku was a talented drawer. He wasn't the greatest, was only 5 years old after all, but his drawings were still good for someone his age. He was comparable to the drawing skill of a talented artist in the 2nd grade, which, mind you, was better than the other kids in his grade. He wasn't drawing stick figures and scribbling. He had basic fundamentals, and he knew depth and perception. He wasn't amazing, mind you, but he could draw a decent enough cityscape for a kid his age. That was beside the point, though. His point was the last few drawings that he had been doing were bizarre. It depicted a battle. It was in Tokyo, and all the buildings were drawn to look like something from the early industrial era of Japan. In the drawing, several brightly colored individuals wielding blades fought against a man with many mouths on his body with flailing thin tendrils. He had drawn that exact scene for the last 6 times he had come home. It had been burned into his mind, and he had no idea why. But with each attempt at drawing it, he was able to flesh out more details. He wasn't great, and some of the parts were still sloppy, primarily how the people looked, but when he put his pencil to paper, he felt as if he was drawing out something that he had witnessed. It was odd, and it bothered him. So, he reasoned that if he drew it out, it would go away. But the image persisted, alongside the aching feeling of failure. He didn't know why that was, but it was extremely annoying and frustrating. Time slipped through his fingers as he finished the landscape of the scene in his head when he heard the front door close, followed by his mother calling out to him. Putting his pencil down, Izuku leapt off the chair, a smile on his face as he opened his bedroom door and ran over to his mother, who was standing in the entrance. Inko Midoriya was a lot like Izuku, at least when it came to her hair. It was bright green with black roots, and it reached down to the center of her back, flowing out like a waterfall. She had cream-colored skin and emerald green eyes. Her figure was cut slim, and she was dressed in a black business suit and a matching black business skirt that stopped just below her knees. His mother worked at the manual agency as a receptionist in New Hero Agency based in Hosu, which was a quick bullet train ride from Mizutofu. Prior to that, she had worked at Genius Office as the same thing, but was laid off after 7 years of working there. It wasn't because of anything that she had done, but because it was expensive to go back and forth, and best genius knew that it would have been better if she had gotten a job at a different agency that was much closer to home. Had even gone out of his way to hook her up with the manual agency, since it needed a receptionist. It was awfully kind of him. "Mom!" Izuku exclaimed, wrapping his arms around her torso as he crashed into her, nearly causing her to go off balance. "Whoa, Izuku!" Inko cried in shock before catching her balance and embracing him. A soft giggle escaped her lips as she lifted Izuku into her arms. "Sorry for being late. I was caught up in work." "It's okay. Izuku, can we have dinner soon? I'm really hungry." "Yes, Izuku, we can have dinner soon." Inko lowered Izuku to the ground, ruffling the mop-like hair on his head. "Let me get settled, and I'll make some delicious katsudon." "Yeah." With help of Izuku, dinner was severed in no time. Katsudon, one of Izuku's favorite dishes since he could chew solids. After a brief thank you to Kami for allowing them to eat that day, they both dug in. It's said that, between the ages of 4 to 6, children will begin to experience their quirk come into being. Sometimes, they need a trigger to awaken for the first time. Others simply exist as they naturally would. When Izuku was born, his quirk was more pronounced than others. His ability to regenerate, even if only a tiny amount, was significant since those kinds of quirks were extremely rare. Although, it wasn't all that flashy or interesting. A cause of ridicule beyond his spooky appearance. However, what no one, not even Izuku, knew, was that it was just the beginning of his powers. That said, a catalyst would need to happen in order for him to discover said powers. And that catalyst was now. As soon as he finished eating his beloved katsudon, his stomach growled, as if upset. Inko looked at Izuku, eyebrow raised as Izuku covered his mouth, his pupils dilating. "Izuku." Before Inko could get up and walk over to him to see what was wrong with him, Izuku bent over and vomited, barely digested food, and while spewing all over the hardwood floor as Inko rushed over to be by his side. It wasn't long before he was finished, when not even a second later, Izuku passed out in her arms. Volume 1 Chapter 3. Thusly, the moon rises upon a new epoch. Change. Change was something that Izuku didn't like. Simply put, he liked the way things were. End of discussion. Patterns, information, knowledge, logic, it all lined up in a nice and orderly fashion that made it so that he didn't have to alter a thing. Even at a young age, he had already grown to despise change. And it was because of his hatred of change that caused him to be shocked at his current, unknown location. A sensation of doubt and confusion filled his mind, plaguing him with questions he didn't have the answers to, which was yet another thing that he loathed. There was a gap in his memory. He couldn't quite remember what happened prior to blacking out. All he remembered was that he had been about to sit down and have dinner with his mother, when suddenly he threw up, and then, nothing. Now, here he was, sitting in a hospital bed, the light of the moon shining down on him through the window he was sat next to. The white sterile curtains were drawn back, and the window itself was cracked open just a smidge to let air flow into the room. "Why am I here?" Izuku wondered, looking around his surroundings. 5 other beds were in the room with him, though they all had curtains drawn around them. He was the only one who didn't. He couldn't guess as to why, but it didn't matter. Not to him, anyway. Over to his left, there was a small table, and on it was a note. It was written in hiragana so that he could read it, and the handwriting belonged to his mother. Hers was the only one that looked a little scratchy, aside from his classmates, of course. "If you wake up late at night, and I'm not there, I'm talking to the doctors on the 1st floor, and you're on the 3rd. Be patient. I'll be back soon, love, Mom." Izuku blinked. Was he sick? No, he wasn't sick. He didn't feel sick, anyway. What's going on? Izuku never got sick. Not when he was an infant, not when he was a toddler, and not in recent memory. Hospitals were for sick people, and unless something changed, Izuku shouldn't be here. Izuku looked down at himself, blinked, then frowned. He didn't feel ill, though he guessed he wouldn't know what to look for or know what being ill felt like. Although, if he had to guess, it probably didn't feel good. After all, ill was a term used for something bad. He learned that in language class. He looked over to the moon, of which stared down at him from the inky abyss. It was like a massive eye, wide and unwavering, observing him. Judging him. Izuku had always admired the moon. It was like looking at a familiar friend. He felt safe under the light of the moon. Unlike the light of the sun, which was harsh and demanding, the light of the moon felt like a soft blanket or a gentle touch from someone who was filled with compassion and care. He and the moon, in some bizarre way, he felt as if he was connected to it. He had heard tales of how the moon was actually the true form of a god. Tsukuyama no Mikoto. He was the brother god to Amaterasu Amakami and was responsible for the sea and storms. Izuku wasn't one to believe in gods. He saw them as nothing but folk tales for others to find safety in. But Tsukuyami felt real to him, as if the real-life deity shone down on him, as if it was trying to tell him something. Alas, he knew he was too young to understand it. This was why he loved learning, so he wouldn't be confused about every little thing that plagued his curiosities, though he supposed that was why he was born as intelligent as he was. It was painful at times, not being able to think like Bakugo or Matsuda, not being blissfully unaware of how boring the world really was. Sometimes, a part of him wondered if he was perhaps cursed. Izuku. His mother's voice cut through his thoughts like a precise knife, and before he could register anything, she quickly embraced him, catching Izuku off guard. "Oh, my precious Izuku. You're all right. I was so worried." Mom." Izuku squirmed for a few seconds, only stopping when he heard her sniffling. "Mom." "I'm sorry, Izuku. I should have known. I'm so sorry." "Huh." Izuku leaned back, a prompt from him for Inko to let him go, which she did. "Know what? I was afraid you wouldn't be aware." Another voice, this one belonging to a stranger, spoke out as Izuku looked over his mother's shoulder. The voice belonged to a man of slim build, wearing a white lab coat and blue scrubs underneath. He had a pair of thick black-framed glasses alongside a small comb-styled black mustache, with matching black hair that stopped just below his ears. The man was slightly taller than his mother, and he carried himself with an air of professionalism that unnerved Izuku just a tad. His arms were behind his back, and his expression was borderline somber as if he was about to deliver dire news. "Who are you?" Izuku questioned, his eyes narrowing slightly. He didn't trust the man, granted. Izuku wasn't one to trust easily, given his circumstances. It was something that the man seemed to recognize immediately, clearing his throat. "Young man, my name is Dr. Junichiro Hazamada. I'm a quirk specialist, and my quirk allows me to see through walls. It is simply called X-ray vision. Firstly, I should inform you that you've been asleep for well over 3 days," Dr. Hazamada said, catching Izuku once again off guard. 3 days? Yes, it was caused by malnutrition, or, if that word's too big for you, simply put, you've been starving. As Dr. Hazamada said that, Izuku couldn't help but scowl in frustration. "But, Mom feeds me every day." Izuku was puzzled. How could he have been starving? It didn't make any sense. His mother fed him daily, and he ate 3 square meals a day. It didn't make even a lick of sense. None at all. "Yes, she does. However, with your mother's consent, while you were asleep, we ran some tests on you to figure out the root cause of your malnutrition," Dr. Hazamada explained before pulling something out from behind his back. The object in question was a see-through bag of blood with a cap on top of it, like a water bottle. "You must be hungry, right?" Izuku's stomach audibly rumbled, prompting Dr. Hazamada to chuckle. "I'll take that as a yes." Dr. Hazamada stood next to Inko, glancing at her as she nervously nodded. "You see, during those tests, we found that your body rejects all forms of food, raw or cooked." Dr. Hazamada paused for a moment, before standing next to Inko, flanking her left as Izuku kept a trained eye on him. Then, he continued, "In a last-ditch effort to save you from starving to death, one of my co-workers, Dr. Hiroichi, decided to feed you various kinds of blood. After many attempts at feeding you many different kinds of blood from varying sources, there was only one kind of blood that worked. I'm here to prove my hypothesis." Dr. Hazamada handed Izuku the bag of blood. As Izuku stared at it, a single eyebrow raised in curiosity. As he stared, he couldn't help but feel tempted to rip into the bag, as if something was shouting at him to consume the fluid within as if it was liquid gold. Caution coursed through his veins as he blinked. "You want me to drink this?" "Yes. If you throw up after you've consumed the bag, then it will be marked as a fluke. However, if it is wrong, things could be even more dire than before. Should you not throw it up, then things will be less dire, although it will cause you problems in the future. As Dr. Hazamada said that, his voice contained a hint of worry. Izuku looked to him, then to the bag of blood. Blood. Izuku didn't know what to think of blood. It had always fascinated him to some extent. Whenever someone at the school would get a cut or a scrape, he could smell it from a long distance, usually about 10 to 15 meters away from where he was. He didn't know why that was the case, and never really bothered to care about it either. So, when he took the cap off the bag of blood, Izuku didn't expect to be assaulted by a sudden fragrance that could only be defined as something alluring, like freshly cleaned laundry, or his mother's cooking, or the sweet smell of freshly baked mochi. Izuku could feel himself drooling, which he quickly wiped away with his free hand. He wasted no time, putting his lips to the bag as he downed the whole of it in one go. He made sure none of it spilt over, and by the time he was done, Izuku felt refreshed. Inko looked mortified, and Dr. Hazamada looked intrigued. Unbeknownst to Izuku, his eyes were glowing. Granted, it only lasted for a few seconds before it vanished. It tasted like what he imagined pure bliss distilled into a food would taste like. He was on cloud nine. Never in his life had he tasted anything as good as this. Not even Katsudon could compare. He licked his lips, his eyes frantically looking from left to right to find more, but much to his displeasure there were no more bags around him. How do you feel, young man? I feel. Izuku didn't know how to reply. Energetic? Amazing? Euphoric? What was there to say? Better. Izuku replied as he felt something within him stir. He felt strong, like he could punch a hole through a wall with ease. What does this mean, doctor? Inko asked as Dr. Hazamada hummed. It means that not only does your son possess attributes of a transformation-type quirk with his regeneration, but his body has also somewhat mutated. His body seems to only accept blood, specifically human blood. How am I supposed to get him blood to drink? Inko exclaimed, worry written all over her face as Dr. Hazamada frowned. When you get home, I suggest that you sign him up for the blood reciprocate drive. Pro Hero Vlad King set it up to help those with blood-related quirks. Every month, you'll get 30 bags of blood for a fee of just over 20,000 yen, paid monthly. It should keep young Izuku sated, Dr. Hazamada said as Inko frowned. She looked hesitant, and who could blame her? She was already strapped for money as it stood, so paying for another expense was something she couldn't truly afford to do. However, given that she would have to buy less food from now on, it could lighten the budget for something like this. I don't have much of a choice, Inko thought, looking over to Izuku, who was absently squeezing his hand into fists repeatedly, as if amazed by something. She had desperately wanted her son to be normal as one could get in a quirked world, mind you, but still normal. This development threw that completely out the window. She thought back to her mother, and how she chided her when she told her mother that she was going to be running off with Hisashi. Before she had married Hisashi, her name wasn't always Inko Midoriya. It had been Inko Soriyama, and she had been a part of a rather wealthy clan of talented swordsmen and women. Inko, however, never had any talent with a blade, so she decided to be a simple Styathome helper. Her father was disappointed in her, but her mother had shared the same talent with a blade, or more rather lack thereof. When she met and eventually married Hisashi, her father wanted nothing to do with her, casting her out of the clan and forbidding her or any of her children to so much as even look at the estate ever again. A harsh punishment, but the Soriyama family was steeped in tradition and were staunch upholders of it. Apparently, from what she could recall of what her father had said, they were descendants of a once mighty clan that hailed all the way back from the Heian era. What that clan's name was eluded her entirely, but in the end, it didn't matter. It was unfair, but then again, so was life. If only she had their help, maybe things would be easier. But as it stood, she was on her own. Her ex-husband was a whole continent away and had accused her of cheating on him due to Izuku's quirk. Her family had banished her, and no one in her family wanted to talk to her. Mitsuki already had her hands full with her own son, and all of her other friends weren't exactly overflowing with money. A sigh escaped her lips as she looked over to the doctor, nodding. Very well. Good. Now, all I need you to do is sign the release form downstairs, and you'll be good to go. Not too long after Inko did as she was told, and after a short walk to the train station to take the train home, sitting near the doors of the train, she glanced over at Izuku, who was transfixed on the moon. She wouldn't deny that she was extremely worried for him, but that was to be expected. She wasn't a fool. Inko was well aware of the bullying occurring at his elementary school and had more than her fair share of angry phone calls to the school for not doing their job, but this was going to be worse. When his peers realize he's no longer bringing lunches to school or partaking in snacks, questions are going to be asked, be it by other children or faculty. Knowing Izuku, he would be blunt and forthright, and that will only make things worse. Forget being bullied for being weird and standoffish. Rumors would spread that he would bite people to consume blood. He was going to become a prime target for bullying. Cammy forgive that he fights back, because that would make things even worse. The last thing she wanted was for Izuku to be a loner, but things were shaping up to be that way. Getting off the train, the rest of the walk home was done in silence. When they finally got home, Inko made it a point to call the drive and sign her son up as soon as possible. She paid the upfront fee and was assured that she would receive a box of donated blood within the next 12 hours. She also called her work to schedule a day off, which had been a struggle to do because her boss tried to guilt her into coming in. After it was all said and done, she turned to look around for Izuku, who was seated on the couch, watching TV. Inko sat next to Izuku, who glanced at her before looking back to the TV. He was watching another one of those educational documentaries, which, now that she thought about it, her son was never normal, was he? Izuku had always been driven to learn and absorb knowledge, a trait he had inherited from his father. Although, there was also the fact that Izuku was more inherently knowledgeable than most kids his age. He was also cold, not as emotionally open as the others, which didn't help with his reputation. It made Inko wonder if he was a sociopath, or if he was simply antisocial. Another thing I should probably get him checked for. There was also another thing she would have to do. She had to get into contact with her family, somehow, and see if their family had any history of blood-related regeneration quirks. She knew it would be difficult, but she had to know if this came from her side, or if this came from Hisashi. If it did come from Hisashi, then she had even more reason to not want to have anything to do with him. Looking toward the documentary, it was about the medical properties of plants. Specifically, the episode had been about the blue spider lily, a plant with the perceived supernatural ability to grant intense genetic healing properties if consumed correctly. From time to time, as the documentary carried on, Izuku would glance over at Inko, then back to the documentary. There was a curiosity in his eyes. After the 7th time he did so, Inko sighed. She had sat next to him for a reason, after all. Izuku, we need to talk. It's about my need to consume blood, isn't it? Yes, Inko replied curtly, her tone serious. You cannot, for any reason, tell any Oni aside from the teachers. Yes, Mom. Do you know why, Izuku? Izuku didn't respond, having gone back to staring at the TV. Inko sighed, crossing her arms. I know you're being picked on at school, Izuku. Inko pressed, causing Izuku to freeze, slowly looking over to her, shocked. How? I never told you anything. Mother's intuition, Inko said, turning to fully face Izuku as she put both her hands on his shoulders. Izuku, it's not healthy to shut away your feelings or to keep things from me. Even if you think it will stress me out or make me worry about you more than I already do, or no matter how dire it may be, I need to know. As your mother, it's my job to help you. Izuku looked down at the couch cushion, embarrassed. Okay, Mom. Inko frowned. Izuku, I mean it. You can talk to me if something or someone is bothering you. I know. Inko's left eye twitched, inhaling sharply before exhaling. That means, Izuku, you have to tell me who it is. Izuku then looked back up at her, his face devoid of any meaningful expression other than a blank stare, before opening his mouth and saying, Everyone. Inko blinked. What? Everyone. Everyone at school. Teachers, students, everyone. Izuku paused, looking at the ground for a second, before looking back up at Inko. My teacher, Ms. Kawakami, is the only one who tries. Everyone sees me as a freak. The other staff refuse to step in when Bakugo picks on me. Today, he used his quirk on me and gave me a nasty bruise. It healed, but still, Other students also pick on me, but Bakugo is the worst. Inko stared. She had no words. Katsuki was picking on Izuku? Katsuki used his quirk on Izuku? Motherly rage began to boil in her blood, and it took everything in her power to not drop everything, call Mitsuki, and berate her for not reigning in her unruly son. But Inko was a patient woman. She could wait until tomorrow. That being said, she needed to know more. Izuku, how long has this been going on for? Since the beginning of the year. And slowly, that patience was starting to wear even thinner. Was Mitsuki dense? Did she know and not do anything about it? No. Mitsuki wasn't like that. She believes so defending one would be entirely out of character, especially if it was her own son. Inko banked on the fact that Mitsuki didn't know. Do you want me to handle it? No. What? Now Inko was confused. Izuku, why? All I'd have to do is call Mitsuki and she will only make it worse. I would be a snitch and Bakugo would make my treatment 10 times worse, Izuku replied, sighing. As nice as it would be, I'd much rather put him in his place. What do you mean by that? Inko asked, confusion lacing her tone as Izuku balled his right hand into a fist. When I drank that blood, I felt slightly stronger than before. Not by a lot, but it gave me an adrenaline rush, and even now, I can tell that my power has increased, Izuku said, before calmly slamming his hand down on the wooden coffee table in front of them. When he did, a small crack appeared in the table as Inko's eyes widened. So he also gained extra strength when he drank blood, on top of it being the only thing he could consume? But more importantly, never do that again, Izuku. That table cost me over 100,000 yen. Sorry, Izuku apologized, bowing his head as Inko sighed. Nevertheless, it was good to know. Now, Izuku, when you mean, put him in his place, I hope you don't mean you're going to hurt him, Inko said as Izuku raised an eyebrow. But he hurts me. Why shouldn't I respond in the same way? Izuku asked, tilting his head as Inko smiled. Because, Izuku, 2 wrongs do not make a right. However, that doesn't mean you have to endure it. You could simply embarrass him if you truly want to get back at him. You don't have to resolve conflicts with violence. As Inko said that, Izuku looked over at the TV. For a while, he stared, not saying anything as Inko waited. He was thinking his eyes gleamed a certain way when he was pulled into deep thought. After 5 minutes passed, and the documentary went on an ad break, Izuku finally responded. Yeah, I suppose that could work. Inko let out a sigh of relief. Truth be told, Inko was concerned about Izuku's mental well-being. With how he thought, and with how emotionally distant he seemed to be, Inko was worried that he would become a villain. But Inko would like to think that she could be a good enough parent to prevent him from heading down that path. And as the moon shone in the sky, its pale blue radiant light casting a shadow down upon the apartment building that the Midoriya family resided in, a haunting chill overtook the night. Whether Inko knew it or not, fate had different plans for the happy family of 2. A storm was approaching. It would not be a literal storm. It would not take the form of lightning or thunder. It would take the form of something else. Something small. Something seemingly benign, but in reality, was the exact opposite. It would not be a physical thing, either. Merely, it would be an idea. What that idea was, however, would not be important for a long time. And before either of them knew it, 6 years passed in the blink of an eye. Volume 1, Chapter 4, Izuku's Ordinary Life. Time was a fickle thing, ever marching forward to the beat of the eternal drum, never stopping for anyone or anything. A stalwart soldier, obeying its sole command to keep moving. For that reason alone, Izuku often wondered what would happen if one day, time stood still. What would happen? Would anyone know if time had stopped? What if it stopped right now? Would he even know if it happened? Most likely, the answer to that question was no. Sitting at his desk, staring down at his completed English test, Izuku frowned. It was too easy. Then again, perhaps that was his own fault for being too smart. Compared to everyone else at Aldra Junior High, he was considered as intelligent as someone in their first year of college. It made a lot of people in his class jealous. Not that Izuku particularly cared on how they thought. If they wanted to be jealous, then that was on them for not studying. He looked around the classroom. Izuku sat in the fourth row near the back, specifically in the middle of the row on the right side of the classroom nearer to the windows. Everyone else still had their heads down, struggling to complete their work. Even Bakugo, who was in front of him in the third row, was struggling, grunting, and cursing. English was never his strong suit. It wasn't much of a shock. Despite being the pinnacle in all of the school, even Bakugo had his faults and issues, discounting his personality, of course. Izuku picked up his test paper and approached the teacher's desk with it in hand. The teacher looked up at him as he approached, and for a second, he saw the man shudder. That was to be expected. One look at Izuku would give anyone that impression. Izuku was odd. While he wasn't exactly the most bizarre looking, he reached that perfect blend between normal and bizarre. For someone of Japanese descent, Izuku was eerily pale, as if any prolonged exposure to the sun would cause him to burn up in an instant. His eyes, open, wide, and his pupils pointed and sharp with a menacing crimson-red color. Despite being dressed in the typical Aldred Jr. high uniform A black button-up blazer, matching black pants and shoeset still didn't give him the appearance of a schoolboy. Rather, to those who viewed him, he looked like a horror monster disguising himself as a schoolboy. Most schoolboys smiled. Izuku never smiled. Most humans blinked frequently. Izuku rarely blinked. Most people brought food to places that didn't serve it. Izuku didn't even eat, as far as the rest of his class was concerned. Izuku Midoriya was odd. Despite all of those oddities, Izuku behaved like a regular person. Izuku was polite, and no matter how he was treated, he either ignored said treatment and carried on with his life, or politely requested it to stop. He never went out of his way to be violent, and despite his freakish appearance bordering on the uncanny valley, he never acted like what was expected of him. "I'm finished the test, Mr. Adachi." The teacher gulped, taking the test away from Izuku and placed it in the completed bin. Izuku's eyes glanced over at the time. 3:10 p.m. Glancing back, Mr. Adachi nodded, taking the silent question and nodding. Without so much as a word, Izuku walked back to his desk, gathered his pencil and pencil box, before making his way out of the classroom. Izuku Midoriya was not normal. He was more robotic than human. His ghoulishly calm demeanor, his emotionless voice, his far too rigid stature, his maturity being more than most adults. Izuku was expected to act more like a child. But the problem with that was that Izuku didn't feel like a child. He wasn't childlike, and he never had been. Even when Izuku was 6 years old, which was 6 years ago, making him 12 now, had felt double his age. Even more so now, he didn't feel like he belonged, and it reflected in his test scores. He aced everything. He had top marks in his academics, in physical education, and even in the very few extracurricular activities like art. He was compared to some of Japan's famous artists from eras past, especially with the particular otaku/anime style of drawing he and most others favored. Izuku had even started his own manga that updated weekly. It was a shoujo romance manga about two girls who had been pining for one another, but had no idea how to express themselves, and wound up inadvertently in a love square with the two male leads, who had feelings for each other's girl, and it sort of devolved from there. It was ironic, because Izuku didn't have romantical feelings, and yet his manga, of which had started publication when he was 10, had consistently hit the top 20 rankings in its particular category. The best part, at least to him anyway, was that no one knew it was him aside from his publisher, as he went by the pseudonym Michikatsu Tsujikuni. As for why he picked that alias, he didn't exactly know. It simply sounded familiar, and that had been the end of that. Walking down the halls of his school, hands in his pockets, his messy bush-like hair swaying back and forth as he walked, he began to plan out what he was going to do when he got home. Studying first came to mind. His mother wasn't going to be home for a few hours due to her increasingly demanding work schedule. His poor mother. He hated seeing her overworked as much as she was. He had heard there were ways for him to gain some extra money online. He knew where to look, too. It wouldn't be too difficult for him to acquire some money. That can wait, Izuku thought as he came to his destination, the front of the school. It was there where all the lockers were, split into 6 rows, with said lockers being split into 2. Izuku's was the first one near the entrance in the 5th row, on the top portion. Inputting his combination, he unlocked the miniature locker, put away his pencil kit and adjusted his school books, before closing the locker and snapping the lock shut. Over by the entrance, there was a shoe cubby. His shoes were near the front, and after slipping off his school shoes, he put on his pair of home shoes just as the bell rang. The reason as to why he liked getting a head start was so that he could avoid the drama that came after school dismissal. Being the top student in the entire school allowed him to get away with it, and he abused it to his advantage. Stepping out of the building and down the small flight of stairs, Izuku walked into the bright morning sun. He shielded his eyes with the back of his hand, avoiding the sun's harmful UV rays as he looked into the sky. It was cloudy, with clouds appearing gray. That meant that rain was a high possibility later. Midoriya, wait up. Izuku paused mid-stride as he looked over his shoulder before straightening his posture and turning back to face the entrance. Izuku Midoriya was many things. He was odd. He was an anomaly compared to most of the other students. He didn't fit the mold assigned to him. He was an outcast. But the one thing that Izuku wasn't was a loner. A girl around his age jogged toward him, long, flowing black hair trailing after her. Amber eyes with similar irises to his met his gaze as a devious smile ensnared her visage. Cat ears sat atop her head as a black tail bobbed in the wind. The girl was dressed in the female variant of Aldera Junior High School uniform. It consisted of the same thing as the boys, swapping out the pants for a thigh-length skirt and black stockings. Before Izuku could say anything, the girl's tail snapped out toward him, wrapping around his waist and pulling him into an embrace that he had not expected, though in hindsight he really should have. The girl squeezed, her arms wrapping tight around his body as he heard her giggle to herself. Izuku frowned. He was never a fan of physical contact. The only person who could get away with it was his mother, Inko, and, well, the girl currently squeezing him like a clingy girlfriend. Which, for the record, they were not a couple. He had no interest in such things. The girl in question just so happened to be a very clingy person, much to his dismay. Please, let me go. Nah. Neikime. Gotta say the magic word. I'm not saying it. Say it. No. Then I'm not letting go. Izuku sighed. He didn't want to do this, but he supposed he was left with no other choice. He was able to get his left arm free, something that Neikime hadn't noticed, as Izuku's hand reached up to the top of her head. Knowing full well the effect his next action was about to have, a small mischievous smirk took up his visage, and then he began to scratch behind the left cat ear on her head. The second that he did that, Neikime tensed, her face flushed red as involuntary purr fell out of her lips. As he scratched, Neikime practically melted into him, purring like a domesticated cat, as if lost in the sensation. Izuku had to hold himself still so as not to fall on the pavement. Finally, after a few seconds on continuously scratching behind her cat ear, Izuku stopped, stepped back, and caught Neikime just as she begun to fall. You're a jerk. I asked you to stop. You didn't. I simply responded as I said I would. You're still a jerk. I know. Good. Meaning. Neikime Natsumi. Her quirk was called Cat. It gave her the appearance of and abilities of a cat girl from those weird pre-quirk era visual novels that he had heard some of his classmates talk about called Nakapura, and he had heard some of her classmates call her Parachan in reference to it, which made her extremely uncomfortable. Curiosity got the best of him, and he decided to look into Nakapura, thinking it to be nothing more than a wholesome game about cat girls. And it was that day that he had learned why it was that Neikime hated the nickname. Because, upon further research on the matter, he wished he could turn back time and prevent himself from ever seeing that. It was a perverted game about cat girls, a restaurant, and intercourse. Lots of intercourse. Why would someone make that? Were people really that weird in the pre-quirk era? Or, perhaps, it was made by a degenerate? How did the game get funded? Who did the art? Why did it make him feel flustered when he saw it? And why did he immediately think about Neikime? Was it because she had been compared to the characters? First of all, that was gross. Second of all, he had no idea that the human body could act like the hope to whatever god or gods that were out there that it was all a cruel joke, because seriously, Why was it still allowed to be purchased? He knew the inner and outer workings of the human body, both male and female, because he studied biology due to his innate desire to learn. So, to see it in such a perverse way made him want to puke on several occasions, not because of the acts portrayed, but because of how hyper-unrealistic it was and how grotesque it could get at times. Because seriously, the human body, in any of its various forms, was not supposed to do any of the things he saw there. Did they do no research on how it worked? Why? He also learned on that day that no matter how much bleach one used to try and clean one's eyeballs, it did not take away memories of traumatic things such as what he bore witness to on that late Friday night. And it prompted him to destroy the laptop given to him by his mother, for it was cursed and he refused to touch it ever again. In order to avoid being punished by his mother, he lied and said that someone at school broke it. Whatever the case was, Izuku didn't quite know, but he remembered being severely upset at the universe that day, and since then, he had never looked at Google the same way ever again, having viewed it as having betrayed him. The next day, he reported those students to the headmaster for harassment and sexual harassment, citing the comments, the source of the comments, and the information of what it refers to with Nakheim by his side. Those students had since been expelled and blacklisted from the district. That aside, thanks to her quirk, Nakheim had enhanced stealth, flexibility, sense of smell and hearing, and she could elongate her tail like a lasso. She was also extremely fast, with a top running speed of over 45 kilometers an hour at top speeds, going from 0 to 45 in 3 minutes. He reasoned that she could get faster if she trained, but due to her lack of a desire to become a hero, she didn't see the need to. While they were at the beach over the summer holiday last year, Izuku found out that she also hated being submerged in water of any depth, could not swim, and had 9 lives, though he wasn't sure about that last one, as it had been an assumption on both their ends, and neither of them wanted to find out if it was true. Nakheim was like the little sister that Izuku never had. She was kind, doting, and protective of him despite the fact that it wasn't necessary. She was loyal to a fault and defended him from his bullies, as she would refer to them. Personally, he referred to them as pathetic whelps with no destined future, though he supposed it was a bit of a mouthful, so bullies work just fine. Okay, can you let go now? Say it. Wow, she's stubborn today, Izuku thought, sighing. Fine. Hello, kitten, how are you? Izuku shuddered from cringe the second those words came out of his mouth. Nakheim snickered to herself, letting go of Izuku. It was only at that moment that he realized he had garnered an audience of people, all of whom staring at them as if it was weird. Which, to be fair, it was. As soon as Izuku looked around at the gathering crowd, they all turned and began to move in the opposite direction of him. It was both a blessing and a curse to be dubbed the creep of a Aldera Junior High. People wanted to judge, but the moment you gave them an ounce of attention, they want nothing to do with you. I love it when you call me that. Makes you look like a dork, Nakheim said, covering her lips with the tips of her fingers, a teasing gleam in her eyes as Izuku turned around, continuing toward the gates of the school. We're going to be late to the train if you keep this up. Ah, shoot. Chihiro is going to be mad at me if I'm late, Nakheim exclaimed as she bolted for the gates. Izuku smiled, watching her leave. Shaking his head, Izuku followed after her, attempting to match her pace, treating it like a race of sorts. Even if Izuku was a tad on the antisocial side, Nakheim had been one of the increasingly few people who didn't mind being around him. Of course, there were a few other people, but they were from different schools. He wondered how they were doing. He knew that they struggled with their own set of issues, too. He just hoped they hadn't gone off the deep end yet. One of his friends, who was 2 years older than him, was already dangerously close to snapping, though. Hopefully, she'd turn out all right. He brought her diet samples of his blood bags every time he went to talk to her. Seeing her smile made him smile, so that was all that mattered. Apparently, she had a crush on a boy named Saito, although Saito seemingly had no interest in his friend. Whatever the case was, he just hoped that nothing bad happened to her. By the time the two made it to the train station, their little race ended in a tie, though Nakheim was left out of breath. Meanwhile, Izuku was doing just fine. Nakheim leaned over, catching her breath as her tail drooped, as did her cat ears. Damn, Izuku, you're getting faster by the day, Nakheim said through labored breathing as Izuku shrugged. What can I say? I'm just built different, Izuku joked. Nakime wheezed. There is no way you just said that. Nakime barked, laughing like a lunatic as Izuku felt a streak of pride surge through him. The cackling came to an end as they entered the train station proper, finding the line that would take them both to their desired location. Boarding the train and sitting next to one another, Nakime pulled out her phone, scrolling through Chirpera, truly repugnant website in Izuku's opinion. Izuku was never really that big of a fan of social platforms, like Chirper, Clapchat, FaceScroll, Nanogram, or StrifeCord. He never understood why people didn't just go outside and speak to others like regular people. Though, he saw the convenience of being able to talk to anyone, anywhere, across the globe. Still, he much preferred to speak in person. Oh my god, Izuku, did you see the leaks for next week's chapter of I Really, Really Love Sakura-kin? I can't believe my Yuri and Sakura kissed. Ah, finally, Natsumi exclaimed as a bead of sweat trickled down the side of Izuku's face. Are you kidding me? I thought Fuyuki-san told me she patched the leakers. Damn it, Izuku thought, frustration evident with his right eye twitching slightly. I see. Oh, come on. Can't you see how exciting this is? I mean, it was an accident and completely not on purpose, but still. Finally, 80 chapters in, and we finally get something. Huh. Take that, Miyatsu shippers. Wait, people ship Mayuri with her teacher? What the hell? It was awkward enough to find out that Nakime was a fan of his manga, but to find out that the fanbase surrounding it was shipping a child and an adult. I hate people. Is that a popular ship? Izuku asked as Nakime turned to face him. Oh, my god. Do you read I Really, Really Love Sakura-kin too? Kinda. Nakime squealed with excitement as the train came to a stop. The announcer came on the speaker and said that the stop was the one that Izuku and Nakime were looking to get off at. Exiting the train with their stuff, making their way out of the station as Nakime blabbered on and on about what her favorite ship was the main couple pairing that Izuku was intending to canonize once the story got to chapter 180, assuming that Manga Jump kept publishing him. Of Corsito, all the reasons why Makashi and Junkara shippers were the spawn of Satan. By the time they made it to the apartment complex that Izuku lived in, Nakime finally finished her rant, sighing as she did. That's why I ship Mikara, because, I mean, they're obviously going to get together. Please tell me you think I'm right. Yup, Izuku said dryly. She must never know I'm the mangaka, Izuku thought to himself, keeping a mask of tranquility over his slowly furthering frustration. Good. As Nakime said that, she gave Izuku one final hug before turning to leave. All right, well, gotta go. Chihiro is gonna yell at me if I'm late. See ya, Midori. Izuku watched as Nakime ran off in the direction toward her house, which was a 20-minute walk from his apartment complex. Turning toward it, Izuku sighed. I should be expecting about, I think 30,000 from Manga Jump tonight for this week's chapter. I could use that for a better suit. As Izuku thought that, he reached his apartment, grabbed the key under the mat, entered the apartment, closed and locked the door behind him, put his backpack on the hanger where he always left it, then made a beeline straight to his room. Izuku Midoriya was many things. He was a student. He was a good, if not sometimes odd-behaving son. He was a smart, intelligent individual trying to make his way through an oftentimes confusing life. But, as Izuku walked into his bedroom and opened up his closet, he smirked. Pulling out a pale blue Oni mask tucked within the recesses of his bedroom closet, alongside a box. Upon opening the box was a black yukata with various floral patterns. A smile took up his visage. Quickly getting changed into the outfit, Izuku dug deeper into the box. Within was a simple tanto that he strapped to his waist, alongside a pair of elbow-length white gloves. Walking over to the bathroom, Izuku took a brush to his hair after wetting it to straighten out the curls, before quickly doing his hair up into a chignon as quickly as one could do that, anyway. Once it was all said and done, he slipped on the mask, opened his window, and Herculean physical strength leapt from his window into the air and across the street to atop the roof of a nearby building. As the sun stretched out into dawn, the clouds turning their milky orangish color to match the sky, underneath his mask, Izuku smiled. By day, Izuku Midoriya was a regular student. By dusk till dawn, however, Izuku Midoriya was not Izuku Midoriya. He became the Moon Scent, an infamous vigilante who struck fear into villains all across Japan. And tonight, he had one particular city that he had heard buzz about not too long ago. A city steeped in villainy and ripe for the picking. Narahata. Volume 1 Chapter 5, Pathological Facade. Heroes. The concept of them sounded childish. Big, strong, powerful individuals whose sole goal was to protect the innocent and nothing more. Pure idealism that ignored the complex reality of humanity. So, instead of directly addressing it, they brandished smiles, spewed slogans, and developed brands in order to keep up the guise. Everywhere you looked, there was always something talking about heroes. Heroes this, heroes that. If one wasn't born into a society had been so hero-obsessed, that individual would lose their ever-loving mind. Government churned out slop meant to do the job that many generations ago would have been handled by the police. But sometimes, the bigwig heroes like All Might, Endeavor, Best Jeanist, Crust, and Wash couldn't help due to either being busy or by simply way of not being on duty. Of course, there were other heroes besides the ones that had been listed, but they would take too long to list. So, when the big-name heroes weren't around to help the everyday populace, a different kind of hero would take a step into the limelight even if they weren't chosen by the government for that kind of thing. Even if their version of heroism wasn't exactly the same kind that was taught. They were heroes, just the illegal kind of heroes, which, while sounding oxymoronic, was true. The heroes of Narahata City weren't really heroes at all. They were vigilantes, illegal heroes, labeled as villains due to their activities being, well, illegal. But that never stopped them. After all, having a fancy license and being given permission to do the right thing was antithetical. Of course, there were times where that label was misapplied to those who were villains, who simply used the guise of being a vigilante to do their nefarious things, which made distinguishing vigilantes and villains harder and harder by the day. Izuku wasn't particularly bothered by being labeled a villain. While Izuku had never killed someone before truly, he didn't want to, but if he was forced to make a choice, he would have seen articles labeling Moonsen a villain. It made sense. Vigilantes and villains were seen in the same light by the public. Only on very few occasions is a distinction made. Vigilantes also worked in groups. Typically, anyway. There was one particular group known as the Narahata Vigilantes that Izuku had done some research on, and had found that they, along with the help of Eraserhead, took down a massive villain with multiple arms, handing out Trigger to the populace. But what was Trigger? Well, Trigger was a quirk-enhancing drug. It did exactly as it said on the tin, enhance quirks. However, depending on the variant, it could have multiple different side effects. One of those side effects was losing one's sense of reason and also lessening the blood flow in an individual's body. Overdoses on Trigger happen by the thousands every day across the world, which sounds like a lot, and it was, but in comparison to the global 15 billion human population, it wasn't all that much. While stopping the flow of Trigger wasn't on Izuku's to-do list for tonight, it was something he always tried to keep an eye out for. No, his real reason for being in Narahata was because he was hunting down a fellow vigilante, someone who was going by the name of Stendhal. His reason for hunting down Stendhal was because of his tendency to kill the villains he faced. While it was typically a trait that Izuku didn't care much to hyper-focus on, Stendhal killed any villain, even those who were simply robbing a store for food. That, to Izuku, was unacceptable. Yes, killing villains who want to harm those for the sake of doing so, Izuku viewed as normal. Even if society at large disavowed heroes doing it, that's what vigilantes were for, to help the public in less than legal ways, without breaking the major laws. But Stendhal was something else. Stendhal killed for the sake of killing. He was no better than your average serial killer, and Izuku was not a fan of that. To use the title of vigilante to simply kill those who didn't follow the law to a T was beyond unforgivable. In Izuku's eyes, Stendhal was nothing more than a villain, a true example of someone who the public and police at large would make as the perfect example. Standing atop one of the many high-rises within Narahata, Izuku stood, hands covered by the larger sleeves of his yuka. The evening chill had finally come to embrace the villain-encrusted city with building lights shining to make up for the lack of natural sunlight. It was times like these that Izuku was glad that he had night vision due to his quirk. Izuku Midoriya's quirk, a topic that a lot of people, primarily his classmates, had a vested interest in, primarily because it was all over the place. Regeneration, night vision, enhanced reflexes, increased physical strength, speed, and durability, all of it powered by the consumption of blood, never to dwindle, although his classmates weren't aware of that part. That was why Izuku had opted to call his quirk Blood Boost, at least on paper. For those who didn't read his documents, his quirk and its nature were purposely vague. After all, his mother told him to keep it a secret, especially due to how stigmatized blood-related quirks were. While Izuku never really cared much for being a hero, it wasn't because he believed that heroism itself was bad. More rather, it was because he viewed the system as flawed. Looking out into the city proved that point. Most heroes were dubbed limelight heroes, meaning they only worked during the day. They were fakes. False heroes who refused to do any of the dirty work, only doing it when they knew people would be watching. Meanwhile, at night, people suffered. Granted, not all of them were fakes. Heroes like the Wild Pussycats were normal. So was Team Idaten and various others that Izuku didn't care to mention. But there were also a lot of fakes. He counted Endeavor as one of those fakes, but Izuku was nowhere near the level of power to even stand a chance against someone like Endeavor. Tangent aside, as Izuku overlooked Naruhata, a sigh escaped his lips. Tonight seemed relatively calm. Now, where's my contact? I thought that I had. Yo, Moonsent. A voice, high-pitched, called out as Izuku sighed. Looking over his shoulder, he was met with a rather interesting-looking individual. They were a girl, just a little older than himself. Over her eyes was a black mask, painted on, and her hair was tied up in a pair of puffy pigtails. She was dressed in a devilish black and pink-themed one-piece leotard alongside a black super miniskirt, with a tiny heart-shaped opening in the center of its chest, and a smaller one located on the small of her back, above which were two tiny bat wings. She also wore a reddish-pink bow tie around her neck, a pair of silver pearl earrings, black elbow-length gloves, and on the belt portion of the super miniskirt were 3 hearts that sat in the center. Alongside that, also wore a pair of black knee-high boots, and to complete her getup, she had pink lipstick on to match her hair. "Hello," Izuku began, turning to face the girl, who had a smile on her face. "Pop Step, correct?" "Yup. Gotta admit, when I was contacted by someone claiming to be the Moon Scent, I didn't believe Itari, kinda a legend here, you know?" Pop Step began as Izuku blinked. "A legend?" "Oh." A cheeky grin took up her visage. "Personally, I don't see it. I mean, from what is known about you, you're just a kid, right?" "So are you," Izuku retorted, prompting Pop Step to pout. "Lies. I saw you at school the other day," Izuku stated as Pop Step blinked. Wait, wah. Pink hair, blue eyes, except your eyes are pink right now. My guess is due to contacts, and your voice is the exact same," Izuku noted, a small smirk behind his mask as Pop Step's shoulders sagged. "Darn," Pop Step huffed, before blinking, realization gleaming in her eyes. "Wait, oh my god, I go to school with the Moon Scent." Pop Step practically squealed. Why? Was Izuku really that popular as Moon Scent? As Moon Scent, he had been responsible for capturing upwards to 10 villains, over 24 thugs, and prevented several robberies across Japan. He had started when he was only 10 years old. Around the same time he began his mangeso, he had assumed that while he gained some street credit, he didn't exactly think he'd be known in Naruhata. "I don't understand. Why are you excited about meeting me? I only contacted you because I heard you knew your way around Naruhata. I wasn't even expecting you to be someone from my school. I simply recognized you due to your hair," Izuku said as Pop Step brushed the comment off. "Forget about me for a second. Wait. Actually, don't forget. Iger. Never mind," Pop Step said, clearly frustrated. "I didn't know you were this dull." "Dull?" "And dense, apparently," Pop Step pointed out, jabbing him lightly with her pointer finger. "You've got motion, dude. People respect the hell out of you here. Even mentioning your name causes some of the regular crooks to freeze up. You've got a Tonto, right?" I've heard rumors you've cut out someone's throat with it once. Pop Step said, miming a thin line across her neck as Izuku recoiled. No, I've never killed, and I don't plan to. Phew, that's a relief. Pop Step murmured. Welp, I'd give you a tour, but I've got one of my shows to go do. If you want, I can take you there. Pop Step said, a twinkle in her eyes as Izuku frowned underneath his mask. Naive, fame-obsessed, and annoying. My least favorite combo. Izuku thought, frowning. No thanks. I'm not a fan of pop music. With that, Izuku turned and leapt off the roof of the building. Pop Step, both shocked and a little mortified, ran to the edge of the roof. She looked down below and saw Moon-sent as fit as a fiddle. No injuries or anything. A sigh of relief followed suit. The last thing she wanted to witness was someone killing themselves, doubly so just before a show. As Moon-sent ran off into the night, Pop Step had to wonder what exactly it was that he had wanted. One simply didn't contact her out of nowhere just to ask for a tour. There had to have been another reason. Or maybe she was just overthinking things. Although, she had to wonder, how did Moon-sent get her contact information? Did he guess? Or did someone else hand it over to him? Confusion quickly took over her thoughts as she scratched the side of her head. It didn't make a lick of sense. Oh well, he's just a kid, so it doesn't really matter. Although, I should probably make sure my phone isn't tapped. Leaping off elsewhere, Pop Step hummed to herself. Going from building to building, she couldn't help but get the feeling that someone was off about Moon-sent. She didn't know what it was, but just being near him gave her the shivers. I should probably let the geezer and crawler know. I don't know why, but I get the feeling that we'll run into him again. Come on, just give us what we want, damn it. A bulky-looking man snarled, staring down a young woman who looked to be in her 20s. She had dark brown hair, matching brown eyes and cream-colored skin. She was dressed in a white shirt and black leggings, just casual attire, and nothing more. She had just left home to get groceries and a few things for her boss. Just her luck to get ambushed by a drunkard. I don't have what you want. The woman snapped back, sneering as the burly man scowled. Oh, but you do, little lady. But you do, The burly man spat, reaching out to grab the woman by the neck. The woman recoiled and was about to reach into her back pocket for some pepper spray, when suddenly, without warning, a hand grabbed the burly man's wrist, preventing it from moving as the burly, drunken man grumbled in confusion. Excuse me. A calm, yet young-sounding voice spoke out, as the woman looked to her right and saw quite the peculiar sight. The person in question was small, probably only standing around 4 feet tall, wearing a pale blue oni mask with their hair done up in chignon. They also wore a black yukata with various floral patterns, and were seemingly wearing white gloves. On their hip was what appeared to be a sheath for a tanto, and from the looks of things, they seemed very restrained. I believe that lady told you to leave her alone, did she not? Let go of me, you little shit, the burly drunken man growled, trying to yank his hand out of the individual's grip, but it didn't budge. That is quite rude. Perhaps you would like to try again? I said, let go of me, you little shit. The burly drunken man slurred, slinging a punch at the individual's face, only for them to tilt their head to the left and completely dodge the punch. They then grabbed the drunken man by the other wrist and effortlessly flipped him over themselves, the landing being rough enough to make the man gasp and pass out from shock. Some people just don't have manners. Quite disappointing, the individual said, before looking over to the woman, their expression covered by their mask. Are you all right, ma'am? Yeah, I'm fine. He didn't touch me or anything like that. I was actually going to spray him with some pepper spray before you came along, the woman said as the individual hummed. I see. Tell me, what is your name? Tsukachi Makoto. A pleasure to meet you. Moon-sent. You may call me Moon-sent. Ah, I've never heard of a hero going by that name, Makoto said, tapping her chin as Moon-sent chuckled. That's because I am not a hero. I am a vigilante, Moon-sent replied as Makoto did a double take. You're a vigilante. Oh, that makes more sense. Although, aren't you a little young to be running around like that? Perhaps to some, but I've managed this much for over 2 years. I'm perfectly fine, Moon-sent replied, dusting themselves off. Before I let you go, however, I have to ask, have you heard of anyone going by the name of Stendhal? Sorry, kiddo. I don't know anything about anyone going by that name. Makoto replied, bowing her head as Moon-sent sighed, seemingly disappointed. Very well. I understand. Have a safe night. And with, Moon-sent leapt away up to a nearby rooftop. Makoto had to admit, for someone seemingly so young, they had quite a lot of power if they were able to leap from the street to the roof of a 10-story tall building. Although, she had to wonder what parent would allow their child to run around dressed up as a vigilante. Then again, they were probably unaware of such activities. Nothing for me to worry about. Now, what was it that Captain wanted? Munson's here. Knuckle Duster grumbled, seemingly annoyed. Great. Another psycho. Knuckle Duster, what was there to say about him? He was a tall, extremely muscular man, with a bodybuilder physique. He was dressed in a long hunter green trench coat with a simple wrap around black mask. Underneath the trench coat, he wore a tight-fitting black muscle shirt and a pair of khaki jeans, black boots, black gloves, and a pair silver Knuckle Duster since the code name. He seemed fine to me, Pop Step said as Knuckle Duster scoffed. Yeah, up until he tries to stab you with that tonto of his for thinking you're a thug who wants to beat up on people. Knuckle Duster grumbled, rolling his shoulder. Guy's got a few screws loose, pretty sure he's a kid, too, which ain't a good thing, Knuckle Duster said, crossing his arms. I fought him once, too. He's slippery. Fast, too. We're about even playing field in that regard, but I'm physically stronger. Wait, you fought this Moon-sent guy? A boy with short black, dressed in an all-might hoodie with biker protective gear on his arms and legs, alongside a pair of red lace-up sneakers, asked, tiling his head with confusion written all over his face. Who even is he? Currently, the group of three were stationed in a nearby alleyway, with Pop Step and the boy standing next to one another, whereas Knuckle Duster stood across from them. They were taking a bit of a breather from their patrol around Narahata when Pop Step showed up and mentioned she had news about the contact, mentioning who it was. He had never seen Knuckle Duster's expression twist to annoyance like that before. Whoever this Moon-sent guy, Master doesn't seem to like him much. Wonder why? Is it really just because he ran away from a fight? The boy thought as Knuckle Duster huffed. No one knows. He showed up 2 years ago, started kicking ass and taking names, and declared that he was going to clean up the streets of Japan online. Sounds like he's way over his head. If you ask me, a good idea, but not enough power to do it. Met a lot of people who were like him, and all of them ended up being deranged or die young. Sad to see, honestly, Knuckle Duster said, huffing. But if he's here, he's got to have a reason. What kind of reason? Like the bad kind? Pop Step asked, a hint of concern in her voice as Knuckle Duster frowned. Dunno. But wherever he goes, there tends to be bloodshed. While he hasn't killed people before, at least as far as the public is aware, he isn't exactly reluctant to use his tonto to fight. Coupled with his strength, speed, and reflexes, he's not a fun guy to fight. So, if you encounter him, do so with caution and only engage if I'm nearby. Don't want you kids to get hurt, cause he doesn't discriminate, Knuckle Duster commanded, his tone leaving no room for an argument. But, if he's a kid, wouldn't it be easy to just knock him down and tie him up? The boy asked, scratching the back of his neck underneath the hood as Knuckle Duster shook his head. Don't underestimate people just cause they're young, Koichi. That's how you get killed. If there's one thing that I learned in this type of business, it's that kids are cruel. Especially ones who think themselves unbeatable, Knuckle Duster stated, his tone serious. Now then, you two can go back out if you want. I've got some business to take care of. Just don't get too in over your heads, okay? Gotcha, both Pop Step and Koichi exclaimed. Koichi had to admit that being a vigilante, while stressful, was fun. He had a hobby, a few new friends, and life was starting to look up for him. But little did he know that tonight, things were going to take a drastic shift for the worse. Ack! A strangled voice cried out as a lean man with spikes coming out of his back fell to the ground, blood dripping down his nose as a bruise began to form. Izuku had to admit, out of the two people he had to deal with today, this guy was the most annoying. Behind him, there were several spikes that were shot out at the wall, cracking the brickwork. Had any of those hit Izuku, it would have ruined his yukatan. It cost him quite a lot of money to get, so if it got damaged in any way, he wouldn't be a happy camper. Izuku looked down at the spiked man, the man's tongue lolling out from the side of his mouth. It was tipped black. Trigger. That explains the spikes. Izuku thought, frowning under his mask. Izuku stared at the tongue, scowling. Scoundrel. As Izuku said that, he went to reach for his tanto, but stopped. No, don't do that. Severing the tongue would cause a fatal bleed out. Just because he threatened to damage my yukata doesn't mean I have the right to kill him. That was one of Izuku's major problems. His lack of inhibition toward killing others, especially when he was out at night as moon sent. He didn't know why, but there was something about hunting people that made him want to kill like an instinct that was getting harder and harder to ignore by the day, especially when it came to those who did misdeeds. Looking over his shoulder, he glanced at the unconscious man behind him, the spiked man's victim. He wasn't dead, but he was injured. Reaching into the pocket he had stitched into the interior of the yuka, Izuku dialed 119 and reported the two unconscious individuals, gave the address of the neighboring building, and specified the left alleyway before hanging up and leaving. He had to admit, most nights weren't this active. Typically, in any other city, he wouldn't have to worry about several villains showing up in a night. But Narahata was different. Well, I guess it wasn't called the City of Villains for no reason. As he leapt from building to building, Izuku caught a glimpse of something in the distance. It was a fight between a massive, rocky-looking villain and some guy wearing an All Might-themed hoodie. The man was dodging from place to place, avoiding getting hit several times. He's losing, Izuku thought, as he looked over to the sidelines. Popstep was also there. Are they a team? Izuku narrowed his eyes as the crawling, sliding guy got caught in a pothole and was seconds away from getting pummeled into the dirt, when suddenly, a man with a blue-tinted katana showed up, blocking the punch and protecting the other man. His hair was styled in a ponytail, and he wore a red mask over his face. He was dressed in a red and black tracksuit, with a bulletproof vest over his chest, alongside bulletproof knee pads and elbow pads. Attached to the front of his vest were 6 switchblades, 3 on the left side and 3 on the right. As soon as he came into view, Izuku instantly recognized who he was. Stendhal, I've finally found you, Izuku thought, sneering underneath his mask. However, looking at his current situation, with there being multiple people, and 2 of which who would back him up if he needed it, and it happens to be in a very precarious situation for me if I were to engage, Izuku thought, landing just near the scene of the action, and from this distance, he could hear just about everything, deciding to observe for now. Down at a parking lot where the battle was taking place, Stendhal had to admit, of all the places to witness a villain attack, a basketball court was not the first thing that came to mind. But then again, most villains tended not to care where they attacked, which was precisely why he utterly loathed all forms of villainy. It was why all villains would one day learn to fear the bite of his blade. However, his main reason for engaging the villain wasn't because of the villain. No, more rather, it was because someone needed to be protected fellow meddler, much like himself. The way he saw it, anyone who willingly went out of their way, license or no, to protect the citizens of Japan was a true hero in his eyes. Therefore, it only made sense to aid his fellow cohorts in case they needed aid. He would accept the same from them, too, should the need arise. Quite tough, aren't you? Stendhal mused, switching his stances with his blade as he set himself into a wider stance, his muscles seeming to bulge slightly, before he unleashed several slashing attacks toward the rock-skinned man in various angles, from left to right to up and horizontal up to 8 times, in the same repeating pattern. Blood-breathing first form, hack and slash, Stendhal calmly announced, overwhelming the villain. The blade cut through the first layer of Rocky, catching the villain off guard. Grah! The villain exclaimed, as Stendhal continued his advance, never once letting up. He reached for 2 of his switchblades, clasping them between his pointer, middle, index, and pinky fingers, forcing the blades out, before throwing them toward the villain's face. The blades lodged themselves into his exposed cheeks, although the villain effortlessly knocked them out, snarling before lunging at Stendhal. Stendhal, for his part, sidestepped the charge, glancing over his shoulder. The boy, Stendhal thought, only for his worries to be alleviated, seeing as he was nowhere to be seen. primarily because he had gotten underneath the villain, ramming into his legs hard enough to make him trip. However, just before Stendhal could strike down the villain, the sound of sirens echoed out. "It's the cops," a pink-haired girl called out as Stendhal sheathed his blade. How unfortunate. The villain took that as his cue to pick himself up and bolt, further frustrating Stendhal. "No matter, I'll track him down later. We'd better hightail it out of here, too," the pink-haired girl exclaimed as the boy in the hoodie looked over to Stendhal, rubbing the side of his head as he spoke. Thanks for the save there. Who are you exactly?" Stendhal smirked under his mask. "The name's Stendhal, another meddler like you." Just as he said that, he leapt away, using one of the nearby signs to get atop an adjacent building. These skills that he had read about from his family's old scrolls had come in handy once again. He had been training said skills for well over a decade, and had decided to use them to purge the streets of filth like that villain. Although, as annoying as it was, finding the materials to restore the blade that was left behind by his ancestors was difficult. Thankfully, he had found some in an antique rock store. Finding the right tools, though, was even harder, and he had nearly given up had he not run into a blacksmith during his out-of-city travels. The town he had visited was called Nichibatsu Town, which literally meant Sunset Town. It was a tiny place with very few homes. Although, its main tourist location was a blacksmith ran by a man named Kokori, who was said to have lived there with his family for generations, with Kokori being the latest. When Stendhal had approached him with the blade, the man was positively beaming, saying that he had been waiting for this day before taking the blade and the scarlet ore with him. Stendhal had no idea what he meant by that, but whatever the case might have been, the man agreed to repair the katana and even did so free of charge. The repairing process took well over a week due to how damaged the blade had been, and he had just barely enough material to fix it, but by the time the blade came back, it was sharper and was of better quality. The material, scarlet ore, according to the scrolls his ancestors left behind, was found on Mount Yoko, which was on the southern side of Japan. "One of these days, I'm going to have to go there if I want repair my katana should it break," Stendhal thought as he leapt from building to building, keeping an eye out for the villain. Just as he landed on another building, he heard a tiny thud from behind him. Looking over his shoulder, Stendhal tilted his head to the left, confusion on his face. Behind him was a small individual. They were dressed in a black, floral-patterned yukata, with a pale blue mask covering their face. Their dark green hair was done up in a chignon, and on their hip was a sheath for a tanto. They landed with precision and practiced style, which immediately indicated to Stendhal that they weren't someone to be taken lightly. "Can I help you?" Stendhal questioned as the individual huffed, not out of being out of breath, but seemingly out of annoyance. That could mean either one of two things. They were a meddler like him, or they were hunting him. And if they were hunting him, he would make sure they would never live to regret that mistake. "Stendhal, killer of villains, or better yet, notorious serial killer. Your quirk, Blood Curdle, allows you to paralyze those whose blood your tongue comes in contact with. You primarily fight using a katana and other bladed weapons. It took me a while to find you, but now that I have, I believe it's time that someone puts an end to your rampage," the individual stated matter-of-factly as Stendhal narrowed his eyes underneath his mask. "Ah, I see. Yet another person who doesn't understand. Very well. For interrupting my hunt, I shall deliver upon you a quick death," Stendhal said, unsheathing his katana as the individual unsheathed their tanto. "Do not misunderstand the situation, Stendhal. It's you who will be dying tonight." Volume 1, Chapter 6. Expectations versus Reality. Combat was something that Izuku never truly excelled in. This was a facet of life that he simply did not care for, so one might wonder why he decided to become a vigilante if he wasn't good at fighting. The answer was quite simple. He wished to be better. It was not out of arrogance that he desired to get better, either. Rather, his penchant for learning extended to physical education as well, and understanding how to fight would allow him to get a better understanding of how humanity as a whole functioned. It was one of the many reasons why, when he got the free time he watched the recorded battles that heroes got into. It was to study how the human body functioned, how its muscles would bend and contort to get the optimal angle for an attack. Truly, The human body fascinated Izuku more than anything else. So, when Stendhal launched an attack at Izuku, an upward slash that cleaved up through his chin all the way out of his frontal cortex, he had to admit that he was frustrated that he didn't see it coming. Stendhal had moved like a blur and struck even harder than he could have possibly imagined. It was clear to Izuku that he had gotten way in over his head. As Stendhal flicked the blood off of his blade and resheathed it, Izuku could feel the condescending glare emanating off of him. Now die for your foolish mistake. As Izuku hit the ground, hitting the cement with a light thud, mulling over his blunder, blinking as his face repaired itself, he was left to figure out how Stendhal moved as fast as he did. Was it pure training, or was it something else? What was it that made Stendhal so fast? Izuku needed to find out, desired to know more about him, his curiosity overtaking his common sense. But before he could get up, he could already hear Stendhal retreating. No, he wasn't getting away that easily, not when Izuku had become interested in knowing more. Leaping up from his prone stance, before jumping into the air and hovering slightly above Stendhal's head, Izuku delivered a devastating spin kick to Stendhal, sending him flying down from the roof of the building they were standing atop of down into the streets below, leaving a small crack in the asphalt. As Stendhal slowly stood up, rubbing the side of his head, confusion quickly filled his mind as he looked around to see who had been responsible for such an attack, only to realize it had been the same individual who he had just cleaved into the face of with his blade. What? But how? Stendhal thought, confusion giving way to frustration as he stared into the fractured pale blue on a mask. Now that he could see underneath the mask, even if it was only slightly, he bore witness to an unnerving-looking eye pointed, glaring, and vacant of any real emotion outside of annoyance and curiosity, as if what Stendhal had done was nothing more than a brief obstacle to him. It was made even more confusing when there was the noticeable lack of a wound on the admittedly young-looking individual's face, as if his blade had never struck true. If that won't wound him, then perhaps this will, Stendhal thought, cool, calm, and collected. Gripping his katana, Stendhal assumed a more offensive stance as the individual wordlessly charged forward. Noticeably, his tanto was nowhere to be seen. That meant that he left it on the roof, a rookie mistake, but a mistake that Stendhal planned on capitalizing on. As the individual cleared the distance between themselves and him, Stendhal lunged forward, using his open stance as an opening. Unsheathing his blade and shrinking the gap in less than a second, Stendhal narrowed his eyes underneath the mask, honing in on his target, before thrusting his blade through the young man's chest twice in rapid succession, puncturing both lungs in the process. Fifth form, Pulse Fong. Blood spewed from the wounds and from Izuku's mouth as he staggered back, clutching his chest whilst the wounds healed. But Stendhal didn't let up. He kept going, not wanting to lose his momentum, performing the same attack he had done on the larger villain from earlier, with 8 precise slashing strikes aimed at Izuku's body. First form, Hack and Slash. The overwhelming series of slashes carved into Izuku's flesh, a hiss reverberating from his lips, blood coating the street as Stendhal kicked Izuku in the stomach, sending him to the ground. Stendhal watched him fall, blood flowing from his wounds as gravity took its course, before he fell onto the road with a sharp thud. Stendhal stared down at the yukata-wearing boy, his eyes narrowing under his mask. He watched as the slash wounds began to close up. If he hadn't already believed that the young vigilante had a regeneration quirk, then this more than proved it. That means, given enough time, he'll get back up and start hunting me again, Stendhal thought, scowling. But just because he can, doesn't mean I'll let him. Stay down, if you know what's good for you. I haven't the time, nor the want to battle fledgling like you. Stendhal paused, humming. Your quirk gives you regenerative capabilities. That's the only explanation for you to still be alive. It is a shame that it is wasted on someone like you. Stendhal raised his sword in the air, pointed the tip of his blade right where Izuku's heart would be located, before plunging the blade down. Izuku choked, blood spilling out of his mouth as it leaked from under his mask. Without fanfare, Stendhal removed the blade from the young man's chest, staring down at the body. It no longer moved. Perfectly still, as all dead things should be. He waited 1 second, then 2, and after 3 seconds passed with no sign of moving, Stendhal relaxed. Good. One less nuisance to deal with later. And then, after sheathing his blade, and without bothering to stick around, Stendhal leapt away, using the surrounding signage to boost himself up to the nearby rooftops. He still had a villain that needed killing, after all. But as he left, he couldn't help but feel off. Something was truly wrong about that boy. Something dark, and whatever it was, Stendhal didn't want to encounter it again. Not that he believed he'd have to. After all, he stabbed the boy in the heart, so there was no way he could come back. Right? Of course. What am I thinking? That boy is dead, and better for it. This world, this cruel, hollow world would eat him up and spit him out. That boy lacked true conviction, and so I did him a mercy, Stendhal thought, troubled by his thoughts all the while. Knuckle Duster, otherwise known as Aweo Aguro, was just having one of those days. His day job's paycheck was late, there were no good villains to fight, and to make matters worse, his daughter was still missing, his wife was still in a coma, and everything just wasn't making for a good day. Walking down the streets of Narahata, he was itching for a good fight, not a crappy one. The only good one he had as of recent was against that large fellow a few days back. That fight, that was a real fight. He was dreaming of having another fight like that, and hopefully, it was soon. Granted, he didn't want it to be too soon. He was still trying to get over being rattled by the last big guy, the rock-looking dude. He heard that the cops were calling this pop-up villains instant villains, or something to that effect. It made sense, seeing as how instant they'd pop up. Aweo also knew that it was the trigger that was causing it, specifically the variant known as Idio Trigger. It was a very potent, dangerous kind of trigger that not only enhanced one's quirk, it blinded their sensibilities, making it difficult for them to think rationally. He had seen totally perfect and normal lives ruined by it. Much like any other kind of drug, it was insanely addictive. While he had never seen an overdose before, he had heard horror stories from doctors at the hospital his wife was staying at. How the affected individual's quirk goes haywire, and they have no choice but to kill the person in order to save the lives of others. It was tragic, horrifically so. It was why Aweo hated it so much. He never understood why anybody would use Idio Trigger, or any kind of trigger, for that matter. It was dangerous, and at a young age schools warned about its uses and the danger it represented. Bah, people are stupid, but the people who sell it even worse. Making victims out of clueless kids, or those easily tricked. Worse than scum, Aweo thought, adjusting his mask. His reason for being back on the streets was because he had finished visiting his wife in the hospital, and it had filled him with a sense of frustration that he needed to unleash on some stupid villain. That was his only reason for being out again. Although he also couldn't lie to himself. He was worried about Pop Step and Crawler. They were just kids after Aller. Well, Pop Step was. Crawler was basically an adult, but even then, he acted like a kid, so he still counted. I wonder how Crawler and Pop Step are doing. They better not be gotten into any. Aweo's train of thought halted as he stopped dead in his tracks. During his time as vigilante, he had seen a lot of messed up, terrible things. He had seen murders, he had seen kidnappings, he had even stopped a couple of in-progress rapes. But what he saw, sprawled out on the side of the road, while not anything new, had made his blood turn cold. Rule number 1 about Aweo: never hurt children around him was a father, for crying out loud. So that was your own funeral if you wanted to be that dumb. Rule number 2 about Aweo: if you challenge him to a fight, you better make sure that you know what you're doing, or you're going to lose a couple of teeth. And finally, rule number 3 about Aweo: if he ever caught the person who attacked, brutalized, or murdered a child, he would find them, and he would kill them. What he saw on the side of the road was Moon Scent, laying in a pool of his own blood. Aweo knew that Moon Scent had been a chilled no adult that small and a voice that immature would throw themselves into this line of work. That, and with every other factor lining up, he had long ago deduced that Moon Scent was, at most, a middle schooler. So, to see Moon Scent in a puddle of his own blood was worrisome, and it set off all of his parental instincts. Without saying a word, Aweo ran over to Moon Scent, stopped everything that he was doing, and inspected the young kid without doing too much. He still had a pulse, a faint one, but a pulse. He didn't appear to have any wounds, but the corners of his mouth that were bleeding told him otherwise. His mask was cut, which revealed a very childlike face underneath, which all but confirmed his suspicions. Who the fuck would do this to a kid? Aweo cursed mentally, picking up Moonscent carefully. His first thought was to take him to the hospital, but that most likely wasn't a good idea. After all, Moonscent was a notorious vigilante, and he was known for wearing that exact mask and yukata. But, even still, what was more important? The kid surviving? Or his street cred? The answer was blindingly obvious. Iwao booked it. Frankly, he was being stupid, knew it, but that didn't change a damn thing. Iwao knew some basic first aid, but given that the kid didn't have any external injuries, that meant he probably had internal injuries, which meant that the only people who could help would be trained professionals. However, just as he turned the corner, Iwao had to do a double take, before not only was the kid no longer in his arms, but behind him, he heard the sound of feet touching the ground. Sharply looking over his shoulder, Iwao saw Moonscent, standing, cracking his neck from side to side as he wiped at the sides of his mouth. Damn it, I've lost him, Moonscent grumbled as Iwao scowled. Oi, kid, the hell, you're injured, what are? No, I'm not, Moonscent interrupted, turning to face Iwao. Although, I appreciate the concern. The hell? Iwao thought, confusion taking over his mind. The hell you aren't. You had blood. I'm aware I was bleeding. However, my healing factor is the most potent there is. My wounds are fully healed. While I am ashamed that I lost my target, it won't happen again. Although I was massively outclassed. I knew Stendhal was strong, but… Stendhal? Who the hell is that? Iwao butted in, crossing his arms. Moonscent looked over to Iwao, his one eye narrowed. A serial killer masking as a vigilante. He wields a katana and has several throwing knives on his person. Knuckle duster. I am aware you are strong, but do not go after him. His quirk paralyzes those whose blood his tongue comes into contact with. He is my prey, and no one else's. Moonscent spat as Iwao tilted his chin up, his expression one of disappointment. Kid, that's no way to think. You want to help the weak. What kind of stupid question is that? Of course I do. Then don't go calling people prey, for one. For two, if that Stendhal asshat is what did that to you, you ain't anywhere near his level. Throwing yourself at a wall won't break it. You gotta know what you're doing. First, Iwao stated bluntly as Moonscent looked down at his right hand. He seemed frustrated, but that was only natural. Kids always believe themselves to be invincible, and this kid was pretty damn near close to that. If he could recover from internal injuries like that, he must have gained some kind of god complex. The best thing for him right now was to break it. But, at the same time, he didn't want to pummel Moonscent into the dirt to get his point across. You need to train. I figured. That's the only next logical step, Moonscent said, before looking back at Iwao, nodding. Thank you. Your words, blunt as they might have been, were kind. I'll be taking my leave now. In a blur of motion, Moonscent was gone, although Iwao had seen him leap into the air and atop another rooftop. He frowned, bordering on scowling. Something wasn't right with that boy. He didn't know what, but whatever it was, it almost seemed inhuman. No kid, not even one with a hyperintelligence quirk, spoke like that. No kid's voice sounded that mature, especially one so young at least, from what he could garner based on what was underneath the boy's mask. Something wasn't adding up. Iwao never was the conspiracy theorist type, and he never would, but not unless that conspiracy made sense. But Iwao had a feeling that Moonscent was more than what he let on. And what that something more was had to have been dangerous. Keen Hachisuka had to admit, out of all the people that she had the fortune of running into, Stendhal and Moonscent were not the ones that she had expected. But, all the same, the more people fighting one another and causing havoc, the better. Sitting atop one of the many skyscrapers within Narahata, Keen adjusted her eye patch, a buzzing noise murmuring just underneath. The current body she was possessing belonged to a runaway. She didn't bother to recall her name, Tamao, or something along those lines. It really didn't matter. Just a face and a body that she could live vicariously through. This body, in particular, had short orangish-brown hair, cream-colored skin, and had visibly sharp teeth. The clothing choice, though, Keen could make on her own. Therefore, she wore dark green and white varsity jacket, underneath which she wore a white button-up shirt, a short pale skirt, and yellow and black striped stockings, with brown slip-in shoes her favorite attire, primarily because it allowed her to lure in unsuspecting morons to turn into instant villains. Although, right now, the person who she had the most interest in had to be Muzan. She had been watching him from afar during his battle with Stendhal, and, much like number 6, had a regeneration quirk of some kind. One that seemed to allow him to avoid death, if having been stabbed in the heart wouldn't kill him. Although, it also seemed to give him enhanced strength and speed. Her first initial thought was that he had multiple quirks, but she quickly dismissed the notion. All for One would have mentioned something about a recent experiment and tell them that he had sent reinforcements to the area. Ergo, he couldn't have multiple quirks. That meant that there was something more to Muzan. Something that Keen desperately needed to know. Wonder what that quirk could do under the effects of trigger, Keen mused, smiling. Of course, he wasn't the only one who she was interested in. There were others, but if she could get him alone and secluded, inject him with idio trigger, and watch the chaos ensue afterward, that would be interesting. Standing up, Keen cracked her neck from side to side, easing the strain that she gained from looking down all evening. She had already made up her mind. This week, she would learn more about Muzan. Tomorrow, she'd have one of her bees follow him around out of sight, find where he lived, and find his school, and during it, inject him with idio trigger, just to cause havoc. Besides, it was in schools where the best tragedies could happen. As she walked down the stairs along the side of the building, Keen couldn't help but giggle. Yes, truly, this was ingenious. And the best part? Nothing would be traced back to her. Nothing at all. That was why Keen loved causing havoc like this. She loved making people hurt, loved causing problems, and most importantly of all, loved to watch people die. Humans. Humans were nothing but insects. Humans ruined the natural order of things, so it was only fair to kill them for fun, to cause them as much pain and suffering as possible. Keen was a direct result of humanity's hubris and experiment to give animals quirks. This was all self-inflicted. Even if the others who were a part of the experiments wanted nothing to do with her, including that damned chimera, she would make everyone pay attention to her. After she was done toying with Muzan, she would destroy Narahata. She would make sure that Narahata would be a message to humanity. And that message would be clear as day. You're all weak. Volume 1, Chapter 7, The Annoying Buzz of an Insect. It had been well over 3 weeks since Izuku had gone to Narahata. In that time, he had taken Knuckleduster's words to heart. If he wanted any chance to fight Stendhal, he needed to know how to fight. He needed to get a grip on basic combat skills, but also street and performative. There was just one problem. His mother couldn't afford to send him to any of the martial arts schools, and his wages as a mangaka wasn't earning him nearly enough to afford a monthly membership at any martial arts school. So he improvised. He watched videos online and practiced in parks. He would practice combos on trees, do physical exercise following a calisthenics routine, while also using the money he made as a mangaka to pay for a monthly gym membership, because those were significantly cheaper than any martial arts school. His only problem was not knowing how to test out his newfound capabilities. Not without going out again as Muzan. He wanted To had been behind on his hunt for Stendhal, but for all he knew, Stendhal could have already been dealt with, which would sour his mood. That being said, it wasn't as if he was all out of options to test his strength. Izuku knew one person who would love nothing more than to fight him. Currently, it was after school. Nakime had already gone home, which gave him the excuse to linger around after the bell. Aldera allowed students to be on campus grounds for up to 2 hours after school. A lot of students didn't take advantage of it, but Izuku had in the past. Just like his previous school, he had a mental map of every facility, every room, and every nook and cranny. Aldera, to him, was easy to navigate, as if looking at the back of his hand. He also had a habit of noting every habit of those who he had labeled as interest individuals. The list was a very small one, but it consisted of 3 people. Nakime, Heniamaka Pop Stepan Bakugo. Nakime always left school the first second she got. Henayama stuck around in the theater area to practice her routine. But The most important one for his current uses was Bakugo's. Bakugo lingered around the front gates with his friends, read as cronies, so that they could go to the arcade in downtown Mizutofu, which bordered on two cities, Hosu and Tokyo. That was where Izuku was headed right now. As he did, the wind blowing harshly a sign of an incoming storm, Izuku couldn't help but feel as if doing what he was about to do was a bit of a meathead idea. Izuku never really played into the humiliating Bakugo card often. In fact, he never did outside of intellectual disputes. His reasoning for it was rather simple. Izuku would be the brains, and Bakugo would be the brawn. Izuku was never one for combat. But his wanna-hunt Stendhal necessitated that he needed to get better. And who else better than to help would be the same person who he had convinced that he had been weak. Before Izuku even got within 6 meters of Bakugo, he turned to sharply glare at him. His annoyance was palpable, his shoulders tense, and his right palm already crackling with sparks. Good. That was a good sign. Oi, the hell do you want, freak? Bakugo barked, his glare intensifying, not that it bothered Izuku much. Staring blankly, Izuku adjusted his collar slightly. It had been annoying him before speaking. Bakugo, I wish to spar. Bakugo stared at him as if he had gone insane, balking all the while. The fuck? You? The scrawny freak? You want to spar? As Bakugo continued, he scoffed, brushing Izuku's request, as if insulted. Fuck outta here with that bullshit. Me? Spar with you? No thanks. Bakugo spat, turning his back on Izuku. Well, there goes plan A. Time for plan B. Izuku thought dryly, frowning. What's the matter, Bakugo? Afraid that you actually might lose. To that, Bakugo slowly looked over his shoulder, his eyes gaining a bloodshot tinge to them, his lips upturning into a slight snarl. Excuse the fuck out of you. The hell did you just say? Izuku smirked. Good. He wanted that reaction from him. That meant he fell for the bait. Technically, he was stooping to Bakugo's low right now, but he wanted to try out his new capabilities on a moving target. What better way to do that than to the one guy who had spent most of his life bullying him? I said, are you, the great Katsuki Bakugo, afraid of losing to, as you put it, the scrawny freak? Because that is what this seems like to me. Izuku replied, his voice calm, never once wavering as Bakugo snarled. Oh, that's it. You're dead. Bakugo moved faster than Izuku had initially expected, but he was able to make up for that by knowing what it was that Bakugo always liked to do first when it came to fighting. And that was thrusting forward with his right hand to pop an explosion in his victim's face. Izuku sidestepped the attack, got in extremely close to where Izuku's fingers were barely even an inch away, and then he struck at speeds that most people couldn't possibly keep up with. The speed and force of the blow was enough to leave tiny shockwave impressions across Bakugo's clothes and skin, making him spit up saliva all over the ground, staggering back as he began to wheeze. The 1-inch punch. Izuku thought, but he refused to let up. Giving Bakugo a chance would simply mess things up. So, Izuku capitalized on his moment of weakness, lunged forward, and instead of going for a punch, keeping his momentum, Izuku did a spinning round kick. The sides of his shoes slammed into Bakugo's arm and knocked him over. Bakugo groaned and snarled, slowly coming to his feet. You shitty freak. Bakugo roared, snapping forward as he palmed Izuku in the stomach, followed by a point-blank explosion. Izuku was sent flying into the brick fence around the courtyard perimeter from the force of the blow, the brickwork cracking under pressure. Bakugo lunged for him, but Izuku was smart enough and able to recover fast enough to dodge to avoid the follow-up explosion. As he slipped to the right, he kicked Bakugo's feet out from under him, causing him to face plant into the fence, before Izuku grabbed him by the hair, pulled him back, and flipped him over his shoulder to land on the grass. Then, with a definitive stomp to the chest, Izuku held him there as Bakugo squirmed. Stay down. But, of course, because this was Bakugo, he refused to back down, launching an explosion upward that Izuku narrowly dodged out of the way of by dashing to the right. He caught a right hook to the face, followed by a delayed explosion that sent him to the ground just as Bakugo was getting up. The small burn on his face rapidly began to heal, as Bakugo sneered, looming over him in such a way that his entire face seemed to be covered in shadow. his eyes seemingly glowing red, and his sneer reflecting razor-sharp teeth like a monster staring down its next meal. Fucking freak, thinking you can step to me. Who the fuck do you think you are, you wannabe loser? Bakugo snarled, and only then, when Bakugo was done spewing his repugnant garbage, did Izuku use his position to kick upward and send Bakugo backward, giving him enough space to stand. Shit. Bakugo spat, blood leaking from his lower lip. You asshole. You busted my lip. Bakugo growled, staring at Izuku, who seemed to be fine. Bakugo blinked, confused. How? How could he be fine? Didn't he just sling an explosion at his face? He knew how powerful his explosions were, especially from that range. That should have left at least a bruise. But there was nothing. I think that will be all, Izuku said, brushing off his sleeves, rolling his shoulder. Thank you, Bakugo. I learn a lot from this. And as Izuku said that, he brushed past Bakugo, hands in his pockets as all Bakugo could do was stare. What the hell was even that?